Are you in California?
California.
Yeah.
All right, Dr. Danny. So most people picture competition as two guys fighting over a girl. You study the version almost nobody talks about. What is the female intrasexual competition actually trying to achieve here?
So the main thing that it's trying to achieve is more reproductive success than your rivals. So your genes having a greater representation in the next generation than, like, say, the average contribution of the rival females in your population. And actually, that's also what male intersexual competition is trying to achieve too. So obviously a great way to do that is to fight each other out for mates, but actually individuals of the same sex will compete with each other as rivals for everything that contributes to reproductive success, which is obviously mates, but it's also resources and status and everything else that goes along with that.
And would you say it's the culture that has formed us to be like that, or it's evolution?
So, I mean, it's never one or the other, but it's definitely an evolved behavior. So, intersexual competition is nothing special about people in that regard. So, any species that has sexual reproduction will have sort of an intersexual dynamic where, you know, members of the opposite sex put selection pressure on each other through their mate choice preferences, effectively, and members of the same sex will put selection pressure on each other through intrasexual competitive tactics. So there's nothing special about people in terms of the fact that we have intrasexual competition. That's not special. What's special about people, or rather what's special about every species, is that every species has its own unique ecological niche and its own unique social system and social structure, and therefore intersexual competition manifests uniquely in sort of every species. And of course humans are a quite extraordinary species, and so intersexual competition manifests in us in ways that you don't necessarily see in any other species.
Before we touch bases on, the animal and evolution of the animal, what made you want to start and be a clinical psychologist today and, becoming a doctor? Like, guide us through who you were and what sowed the seed of you becoming and being where you are today.
So I'm not a clinical psychologist. In fact, I'm not actually a psychologist at all. I did technically start a psychology degree, but I dropped out of it. So I'm actually a psychology dropout. I never finished my psych degree. What I did do, though, is I did a Bachelor of Science, and that was primarily focused around evolution, ecology, genetics, parasitology, those sorts of things. So I did that. And then I became very interested in animal behavior. And so I dabbled in psychology as like a psychology degree and just went, no, too much of this is just bullshit, not doing this, not interested in that. So I gave that away and I went back to my science degree and studied animal behavior from the perspective of like a biologist instead of from the perspective of a psychologist. And then I went through and I did my honours and my PhD through sort of that path. And then I ended up getting a job in a psychology department, but that really was mostly just because I could teach statistics. It wasn't really because I had any kind of a psychology background. I talked a good game, but I didn't really have a psychology background. But I could teach statistics, so that was good enough. So now I find myself in a psychology department. And when you're in a psychology department, you kind of have to study people. So I had to kind of take my background in animal behavior and I had to sort of, pivot that into humans. I did continue to study animals. I studied birds for my PhD and I did that for a bit afterwards, but it wasn't really sustainable. It didn't really work. I had to study people. So I applied what I knew about, animals to people, which are really just another animal. We're not really that special. Well, there's nothing fundamentally different about people and other animals. It's all the same systems. It transfers over very well.
So you say there's nothing special like humans. In what context do you exactly mean that? Because, I mean, I'm thinking of like various different animal behaviors, like dogs mating with their own and so on and so forth. But you're like, we're not that different. I'd like to know the context behind that.
We're not different in terms of understanding the behaviors and why the individuals behave that way, how those behaviors evolved, the purposes that they serve. All of that is all of the same principles of behavior. So whether you're studying the behavior of humans or the behavior of non-human animals or the behavior of sort of hypothetical agents in a model, it's much the same theories and the same understanding. Now, humans are obviously an extraordinary species. There's no other species on the planet, and as far as we know, in the universe, at least so far, that it has anything like what humans have in terms of culture, in terms of the capacity to alter the environment, in terms of so many aspects of human behavior. So we are extraordinary in a whole host of different domains. But when it comes down to understanding behavior, our behavior is not magical. There are no sort of magical aspects of human behavior that means studying behavior in humans is just so different to studying it in animals. It's not. It's the same behavioral processes, and it's the same underlying mechanism. They're more complicated and there's different things to consider, but it's not a fundamentally different exercise.
Okay, I see what you mean by that. Your key claim is that women compete for relative success, not absolute. It's often less about winning and more about making sure your rival loses.
Yes.
Can you unpack that?
Yes. So what most people understand already, sort of intuitively, is that the reason why societies send men off to war is, I mean, there's a bunch of reasons, but one of them is that any given population can afford to lose a lot of males, and it will recover the population within a generation or two. Because women, females, I mean, this again is not a unique phenomenon to humans. The female of any population, most part, is the sort of reproductive limiting sex in the population, right? If you have more women, the population has a greater reproductive capacity. If you have fewer women, the population has less reproductive capacity. If you change the number of men, doesn't change the reproductive capacity of the population very, very much. So the consequences of that is that if men were to attempt, for example, to try and sabotage each other's reproductive success by effectively going around and trying to knock other men out of the gene pool using whatever mechanisms you can find, that's not going to affect the background reproductive success of the population very much at all. So it's not going to shift the needle. If women do that, for every individual rival that you knock out of the population, you actually reduce the population's reproductive capacity in a meaningful way. So you can shift the dial by sabotaging rivals. Now, the reason why the population's background reproductive rate matters is because reproductive success is, in terms of how evolution works, reproductive success is competitive. It's relative, right? And when you go to the Olympics, it doesn't actually matter how fast you run. If you're the fastest in that race, you'll win the gold medal. Even if in previous years, you're nowhere near as fast as other people who've won a gold medal. In that race, if you're the fastest, you win. Well, it's the same with reproduction in any given generation of a population. If you're reproducing more than your rivals, you are winning. If you're reproducing less than your rivals, you are losing. So if you're in a population that is expanding and, women are having on average 3 or 4 children and you only have 2, well, your lineage is going to be underrepresented in the next generation. That's evolutionarily losing. If you have 2 children, but you're in a population that is shrinking and the average woman is only having 1.2 children, well, evolutionarily now you're winning. You're overrepresented in the next generation. So women, by manipulating the background reproductive rate, effectively by reducing it, by suppressing it, can increase their own relative reproductive success without actually having to rear more children to increase their own relative reproductive success. If men try to do that to their rivals, it doesn't shift the needle, so they're wasting their time. So they're not selected to do that because it's not actually going to improve their own reproductive success any. So this is something that women are under selection pressure to develop strategies and tactics to do. Men are just not under selection pressure to do this because the evolutionary payoff just isn't there for them. And again, that's not necessarily a human-specific story. That's just a big gametes versus small gametes story. One sex is the reproductive capacity limiter. The other sex is not.
I actually had a guest over in the podcast, and where we talked about races, as in the races that's on verge of extinction, and there's a specific religious group, very famous, which believes in reproducing and having a lot of their own, and they go to these first world countries from third world countries and rely on government for benefits and so on and so forth. I don't know how bad or how much of that you see that in Australia, but in Europe at the moment, it's a chaos.
Yeah.
So you think that religious group understood something that the others haven't, or because their original stance is to have as many kids as possible and to rule the world by spreading and homogenizing one specific religion and one specific ideology and taking over the other ones, while the other ones are, not having as many kids as possible. Is it a financial factor? Is it a psychological factor? Or is it a political ideology factor? What would you say?
So I think it's all of those things, because I think all of those things play into this reproductive system. And so the thing is that Catholicism in particular, Christianity more broadly, but especially Catholicism, also used to be, very much anti contraception, pro having lots of children, having many, many children. And then, the church sort of split, and now we've got more progressive forms of Christianity that are less pro-natal and are less pro-family. But what you're actually seeing is you're seeing a mismatch in where in the cycle these different populations, societies, whatever you want to refer to them as, you're seeing a mismatch in where they're at. Because this is what, according to me, I don't know how many many people agree with various parts of this, but this is the world according to Danny, right? So what happens with human civilizations is when they are young, they are dominated by male intrasexual competition. And in societies that are dominated by male intrasexual competition, what you get is a lot of fighting, a lot of violence, a lot of sex, and a lot of babies. Fair bit of war, the population grows, it expands, it gains territory, it goes out into the world to create more things. And what also happens is it becomes prosperous. It becomes relatively safe for the people within the society, at least the ones that are not on the frontiers where the war and the fighting and the expanding of the territory is actually happening. The ones that are well within the society, well, they're now safe and protected, and they become relatively prosperous. And then what you see is a few things begin to change. Because the society is a little bit more prosperous and a little bit more safe, a couple of things happen. One is many more babies and children survive, especially infants. And so as a result, then, the optimum number of babies that any given woman should have drops down. Because if 30, 40, 50% of the babies you have are going to die, then in order for you to have a certain number of surviving offspring, well, you need to actually have more offspring than that. Once you're in an environment where 10%, 5%, 1% of infants die, well, now it makes sense to have fewer offspring and invest more in each one, because none of them are going to die, most likely, right? So the optimum number of children that you have actually comes down. Because you're also safer and more prosperous, and because the society is safer and more prosperous, and there is less violence, so you need to be a little bit less protected, and you're having fewer children, women have now got time on their hands. What do women do when they have time on their hands? Well, they do what any individual does when it has time on its hands. It works out how it can reinvest that time back into its reproductive success. Now, unlike men, who, when they have time on their hands to invest into their reproductive success, they just try to have as much sex as they can, right? Because that's the male strategy, right? If you want to reproduce more, you have, say, a family unit, you have children, you have to invest in those children, you have to give them resources, you have to give them time. And that's then some of your reproductive success. But you can, as a male, you have the option potentially to really ramp that right up. by having children left, right, and center around the place that are outside of the unit, the social unit within. You have to heavily invest in those children, right? You can go out and you can try and become one of the rare number of men that have huge numbers of children instead of the majority of men that have very few. Now, obviously, women don't have that option. Women can't just go out and have more and more and more children. The biology just limits that. So what do they do when they are in a society that's relatively safe, relatively prosperous, their children are relatively safe, and they don't have to have as many of them as they used to? Well, they start pouring their resources into the other side of the ledger. Instead of trying to have more children, they now turn their attention to trying to make their rivals have less. And so we start to see society beginning to fundamentally shift. And so we see decreases in male intrasexual competition, and we see increases in female intrasexual competition. And this is when we start seeing women engaging in reproductively suppressing behavior and antenatal behavior. And we start seeing societies, when you then, like, let's just fast forward 150 years through that to now, we start seeing societies becoming very antenatal and very antenatal and very hostile to reproductive success. We have now created a social environment that is just not conducive to reproductive success in the West. It's not conducive to it socially. Motherhood does not confer any social status on women the way it used to. In fact, if anything, it robs women of social status financially and economically. We are in a society that is very hostile to reproductive success because most family units require both adults to go out and actually work, which means that the adult, the mother that used to invest heavily in reproductive success and rearing children, simply can't invest as heavily in reproductive success and rearing children as she used to, because she has no choice for the family unit to survive economically to go out into the world and spend, much of her time and resources out also actually provisioning, which used to be the male's job. He used to provision and while she could raise kids. Well, if you can no longer split that and now you need, 2 full-time workers, well, who's having kids and who's raising kids? So economically, socially, politically, ideologically very antenatal, right? Don't have babies, it's bad for the environment. Don't have babies, have a carbon footprint. Don't have babies, that's, selfish and using up resources that other people could have. If you've got extra money, you should be donating it to people who are less fortunate than you, not using it on having your own kids, and a whole host of other antenatal ideologies. So we are currently in a state of our society where we're not very far from, things kind of breaking down ultimately. We're incredibly antenatal and very hostile to reproductive success. Societies that are in an earlier stage of the cycle are still more pronatal than we are, and they're all the other things that we used to be but aren't anymore either. So they're also more violent. They're also more violent, more masculine in general. So greater divergence between men and women in terms of masculine gender roles and feminine gender roles. So you see greater sex differences in how they dress, what they're allowed to do, what their roles in society are compared to our societies. And of course, you also see a lot of babies. And of course, those societies are in the stage where they are expanding. And so they are expanding. Our society is in a stage where it is contracting. And so we are contracting. And they're expanding, we're contracting. It's just maths. If they're expanding, we're contracting, then they're going to end up in our territory, aren't they? And that's,
Right.
That's kind of how the cycles work. When societies become like ours, and they become antenatal, and they become, a whole bunch of other things happen when societies begin to collapse, that are sort of like predictors of civilizational collapse. But one of the big ones is porous borders. Societies stop defending their borders. They stop having, what we might call national pride. They stop, thinking that something needs to separate them. They literally they just collapse down. They just don't defend themselves anymore. And if you don't defend yourself, you can't continue to exist against people who wish to come in and take whatever it is that you've built.
Completely agreed, as it's evidently happening right now.
Yeah.
But I'd like to point out a point that you just said was how if women, for the social status or just competition in general, the way they compete is if they can't have more kids, they'll stop their rivals from having that. How have that come into effect? Like, how do you see that from day to day that you can be and point people towards that? And look, like, this is the true example of how women compete.
So I think a huge part of it is in the civil discourse and the social ideologies that predominate. So if you sort of rewind back to a time, I mean, birth rates in the West have been declining for a long time anyway. But if we go back to a time when society was more pro family and pro mother, and we look at what the feminist messages were around then. So the messages were around things like, women can be mothers and also have careers. Women can have both, and so that it wasn't necessarily being sort of replacing the motherhood with the career. It was just shifting women a little bit away. But then you fast forward another decade or two, and all of a sudden it's becoming, if you're, women who stay as mothers just, they lack ambition. It's definitely on a lower social rung. And so as soon as, whatever the social norm is of what's acceptable, the leading feminist ideology, the leading voices of women, because that's who drives feminist ideology, it's indeed women, the leading feminist ideology just drags the norm further towards the antenatal. So it just drags women out of the home, drags them away from motherhood, valorizes anything that drags women away from motherhood. So it valorizes casual sex, it valorizes eternal singledom, it valorizes careers at the expense of raising families, it valorizes, huge sexual like, there's a word that I'm missing when someone is very sexually egalitarian.
Promiscuous.
Promiscuous, thank you. There are words that mean promiscuous that are kind of less politically correct, and they were the ones coming into my head that I was trying not to say. Yes, they valorize female promiscuity and endless singledom and all of these things that are all absolutely hostile to raising children successfully. And so all of these things, and you can see the same antenatal pattern moving along in the abortion debate. So it wasn't that long ago that the abortion mantra was like safe, legal, and rare, right? That's what feminists wanted. They want abortion to be safe for everybody. That sounds reasonable. They wanted it to be legal. Okay, fair enough. And they wanted it to be rare. This is just for those rare cases of, women who get raped, or, if contraception fails and you're in a terrible position to have a child, things like that. Now, if you look at where the abortion debate is now, it is at abortion on demand, anytime, for any reason, right up until birth. And anyone who objects to that is the worst type of misogynist in the world. Like, that's a long way from safe, legal, and rare. There's not, I could be wrong. I don't think there's a feminist on the planet now who says that it would be good if abortion was rare, right? So you've got a species that much of our reproduction is, like any species, much of our reproduction is based on mechanisms that promote us to have sex, right? To have sex with particular people at particular times. Our reproductive capacity is not around children that are necessarily explicitly planned. Like most species, what we're proximally motivated to do is have sex. That results in babies. We're not necessarily proximally motivated to actually try and have babies. We're much more strongly motivated just to have sex. So you take a species where the reproductive system relies on having sex and not having babies that are necessarily planned, but relies on having sex, and then you convince all the women in that population that any baby that arrives unplanned, any pregnancy you didn't explicitly try to have, should be immediately aborted without question. You're going to just slash the reproductive output of that population. And that's effectively what feminists have done. So they've sort of convinced women that any baby that comes along, if it's inconvenient for your career, if you and your partner aren't ready yet, if this isn't exactly what you plan, just abort it, just get rid of it and wait until you're actually. But that's not how the human reproductive system works. The human reproductive system relies on people having babies because they were motivated to have sex. if you separate the motivation to have sex from the reproductive output, then you're going to massively diminish the reproductive output. And that's what they've gone and done. So I did try to get some figures on this, and the best that I could come up with, or the sort of for the change over time, is that back in the sort of 60s and 70s, about maybe even a bit earlier than that, I'm not quite sure, because then like the pill came in and everything has got a bit different, but about 50% of babies were not planned. So about 50% of the babies that were born were surprises, and about 50% were women who got pregnant because they were actively trying to get pregnant. And now I think something horrendous, like I think it varies a lot from age cohort. It's really high in younger women. It's close to 100% in younger women. Unplanned pregnancies just get aborted. And then as women get older, that number reduces, but it's still horrendously high. So we're taking a major mode by which the human species used to reproduce, and have just convinced women to just close off that pathway to reproduction entirely.
What would you say? So I see there's definitely a lot of points to mention to the society and to the feminists. But now that we're comparing cultures of the West and the East, would you say a monogamy has a part in the play of reducing population in the West? Because in the East, so far I'm aware, men are monogamous. They're very much multiple women, multiple kids, and therefore the population is, 12 times as compared to the West.
So what is important for successful sort of reproductive success is a family unit. So that's really important. And what's important also is obviously the provision of resources. So polygamy can be a successful reproductive strategy when the men who are polygamous have got the resources to support multiple families, multiple wives with multiple children. If they don't have the resources to support that, then that very quickly breaks down. However, the other thing that you get when you get a monogamous system is which is why monogamy tends to arise out of polygamous systems. The other thing that you get when you get a monogamous system is you also reduce male-male violence a heck of a lot, because what you actually have now is a principled sort of like a social code now, where it's now one man and one woman, and the agreement, the deal is that they take themselves out of the mating pool. So as a society, so this is the marriage contract, right? So the marriage contract is not a contract between the two people getting married. The marriage contract is a contract between the couple on the one hand and the rest of society on the other hand. So you agree to get married. Society respects that relationship. We support you to have children. We are not going to be hostile towards you. We will be hostile towards people that have children out of wedlock, but we will not be hostile towards you. We will consider your children legitimate. They will be a part of the society and be a part of the welcome. And in return, you will leave the rest of us alone. You will not try to steal any of our prospective mates. You will not try to interfere into any of our relationships. And that greatly reduces male-male intersexual competition, which greatly reduces male violence. And when you greatly reduce male violence, your society can become even more prosperous. So as societies go from that heavily male-dominated, masculine, male violence-dominated phase into these more prosperous, more peaceful phases, which then ultimately collapse into being unwilling to defend yourself, one of the things that you get is that shift from polygamy into monogamy, because it greatly reduces what it does is it creates social rules. I mean, obviously people still cheat because rules just set the boundaries of the game. Like any game, they are the rules, but you work out how to game them, right? So it's not that once you're in a monogamous system, there's no cheating. Of course there is. There's loads of cheating and there's loads of infidelity and all the rest of it. But once you have this social structure in place, then it creates very clear rules about what you are and aren't allowed to do. And that reduces a lot of male violence, fighting over women, stealing women from each other, blah, blah, blah. So in terms of successfully raising children, it's much more about whether the man can provide the adequate resources and protection and everything else. But then monogamy has other benefits that you tend not to get from polygamy. So it's also about not just the number of children, but about the quality of the investment in each child. And of course, if you've got a very prosperous society, well, then the quality of investment in each child is even more. So it's just part of the whole system, you know, moving along that track that societies move along as they become more and more prosperous, and, you know, everything about the mating system changes a little bit as that happens along the way.
You studied animals. Are male animal species monogamous in nature, or they're mostly polygamous?
Mammals are not typically monogamous. So humans are relatively unusual mammals in having a monogamous mating system. However,
It goes for both genders?
what's that?
It goes for both genders, or
Yeah.
just the male? Oh, okay.
Yeah, both. So generally speaking, in mammals, you don't tend to get, so what drives either monogamy or, I mean, depends what you mean by polygamy. If by polygamy you just mean one male mating with multiple females, well, that's what many mammal systems do. But if you mean polygamy by actually forming like enduring bonds with multiple females, well, that's not very common in the mammal animal kingdom. Mostly because you don't tend to get male mammals contributing very much to parental care. There's exceptions, but it tends not to happen. So in most mammalian species, the males have sex with the females, and the males defend territories, and they fight with other males for those territories, and they fight with other males for access to the females that live on those territories, and the females take care of all of the parental care, either individually or sometimes in groups, or however it works. So as mammals, males providing parental care is relatively unusual. However, in bird systems, it's really, really common. And the reason for that is because young birds require biparental care. So one individual typically can't do it, especially for birds. So, you know, things like little songbirds and things that when they hatch out the egg, they're completely helpless, much like our human babies are completely helpless when they're born. If you compare them to other mammals, most other mammal babies, they're born and they're up and walking around with the herd or whatever, whereas human babies can't do that. Well, bird babies are the same. So what we see in the animal kingdom is we do see various species of birds solving this biparental care problem. And you get birds that are socially monogamous. So they form individual breeding pairs that stay together and raise the kids together. And within those socially monogamous bird systems, you also get infidelity, the same way that you get it within human socially monogamous systems. And then we have other systems where we get birds who do a more sort of polygamous thing, where they might have dominant males that will mate with females who then will sort of raise the eggs, maybe as a, you know, helping each other. So the one male who's fathered lots can't help all those females to raise all those chicks, and so multiple females might kind of sort of band together as a group and help to raise the chicks. So you do see birds solving the biparental care problem in different ways, just like you see different groups of humans solving it in different ways. But generally speaking, even in societies that have polygamy, it still requires there to be social bonds between men and women. The men might be allowed to have multiple wives if he's got the resources to support that, but you don't tend to get a situation very often where the men are just contributing nothing, like in most mammal species. In fact, the only time you see anything like that really is in societies where there are such poverty and zero resources that the men literally would bring nothing to the table as far as parental care anyway. And then you really do see a very female-dominated society as far as looking after children go, and men really do just come in and have sex and leave again, much like other mammals. But that's not something that you see really commonly. As soon as you get any kind of resources, any kind of cooperation, any kind of prosperity in a population, you start to see pair bonding and some sort of coupling happening.
Looking from a bird's eye view down to human animal species, would you say it would be morally correct for a man with unlimited resources, meaning he's loaded, to have multiple wives?
I think it critically depends on what you mean by morally correct. So I think that I'm not quite sure that there necessarily is a universal moral code. So what is morally correct is typically what that society has decided is morally correct. And so a similar question like this kind of comes up when people sort of say, like, are psychopaths evil? And you sort of just go, well, what actually, what is evil? And I think that it's probably not quite the answer that you're looking for, but if we assume that and it's true that the vast majority of people in a population effectively abide by whatever the population's norms are. So whatever population you put people into, they will learn what the norms of their group are, and that's would be a really strong driver of what they do. So some people will naturally be on the egalitarian side of the norm, and some people will naturally be a bit more on the conservative side or whatever, but the norm itself is the anchor, right? So when you've got someone who is, say, a psychopath, whose behavior is basically unanchored from that norm, so whatever the moral norms are of a society, they will tend not to abide by them. So a person who in a society where polygamy was not acceptable, and thus they would think it was amoral and they wouldn't engage in it because they're very strongly following their society's moral norms. If you put that person in a society where polygamy was considered completely morally acceptable, well, then that same person would probably do it because they are very wed to their society's moral norms. I'm not sure that there actually is an absolute morally correct answer to the question of whether it's moral or not. I mean, we can discuss whether it's good or not. We can discuss who it's good for, who it's bad for, who it might harm, who it might not harm. But I don't think that necessarily gives us an absolute moral answer as to whether it's right or wrong in any given scenario, because I think morality is itself a concept that individual societies build to shape how they want the individuals in there to behave. So
you're very, very, very spot on, I must say. Very high IQ answer. Exactly what I was expecting. I'll tell you that. But let's just say if you have to give your opinion on it. Yeah, I mean, that's how I take an approach to, these are the pros of having it, these are the cons of having it. But if let's just say you have to state your opinion on it, because you don't get to just be have polygamy. You need to have resources of abundance, which only, I'd say, alpha men of species usually do. But having resources is not just enough. You need to have the characteristics of, like, the violence and stuff, and then you condemn that violence in other ways of having motivation to have sex with multiple women and having multiple offsprings. So I just need, what opinion would you have on that?
Look, I think it does depend how you frame polygamy. I'm not quite sure. Like, I'm not convinced that it necessarily goes along with the violence and coercion of women. So there are certainly some societies where that's what it looks like, and I think it probably is what it looks like. But there are other examples of polygamy where there isn't really any evidence that the women are being coerced. That is the decision that they've made a world, and they're benefiting from that as well, and they're perfectly willing participants. So I think there's a separate moral value. If we're going to make a moral judgment, there is definitely a separate moral judgment from the mode of polygamy that coerces women into that relationship, and the mode of polygamy that entices women into that arrangement. And I'm not sure that those things are necessarily the same. And I think, like, for me personally, I would be, in terms of having an emotional response to polygamy, especially of the coercive type, but if I'm honest, probably to some extent of the non-coercive type as well, I would tend to think, look, I'm not in favor of it. But I also can't separate that opinion from the fact that I was raised in a society where that wasn't considered morally acceptable. So it would be a bit naive or obtuse of me to think that I'm making some sort of a moral judgment that is independent of what I've always been taught is moral. I'm not capable of doing that. So I can think objectively about what the payoff matrix is and who's being hurt and who's being harmed and who's being benefited. I can talk all about that, but I can't pretend that I can make a moral judgment that is different to any other person's moral judgment, which is that I look at this and I make judgments based on what I've always been taught is right and good, and I can't just be some sort of, non-human alien and put that aside and expect to make a moral judgment, because those things are what the moral judgment is. So I would give the same moral judgment, as I suspect what most people in Australia would give, which is that, you know, we've never had any type of polygamy as far as I'm aware. Maybe there was some little cult somewhere, but to the best of my knowledge, there's never been any mode of polygamy in Australia that has been either officially or unofficially endorsed. So, you know, we haven't had this sort of, you know, the Latter-day Saint kind of polygamy, or we haven't had this sort of more traditional kind of polygamy. That's never been around. And so it's never been something that people in Australia would go, oh yeah, some people do that. That's fine. That's up to them. That's fair enough. Not really so much. And so I couldn't honestly generate a moral judgment that deviated from that norm, because that is what determines my moral judgments, just like everyone else.
Fair enough. Give us 2 truths and a lie about female intrasexual competition.
There are no lies. Give us 2 truths and a lie. All right. I'm gonna have to. I can think of plenty of things that are true. I'm going to struggle to think of something that's not true. Okay. All right. Female intrasexual competition is will curtail under certain circumstances ultimately. So over the course of the civilizational cycle, like I said, that the male intrasexual competition builds and then it dies down, and then the female intrasexual competition builds. So one statement is female intrasexual competition, like male intrasexual competition, will eventually die down. Statement number 2 is that female intrasexual competition is completely ubiquitous and pervasive. And statement number 3 is that female intrasexual competition is the number 1 threat to Western civilization.
This one will actually surprise you and surprise people who are listening. You argue makeup, dressing up, even gossips are often signals aimed at other women, not at men. How does that work?
So what happens with like makeup and makeup is where I've got makeup and haircuts is where I've sort of got the empirical data to say for sure, but this is going to apply to fashion and plastic surgery and Botox. It's all the same thing, right? It's all the same thing that's happening. And what's happening is you would naively think, right, that women wear makeup to make them look more attractive, that they wear nice clothes because it accentuates their figure to make them look more attractive, and you think all of that. None of that's true. So what actually happens is that that might start off. There might start off being a point where something is popular because it's flattering, right? The minute something becomes popular because it's flattering, women turn it into something that is very unflattering and force other women to do it. This is why when you look at makeup, you know, makeup can be put on in a way that is relatively minimalist. It is designed to just cover visible flaws to make your skin look smoother. It might be designed to cover, like, you know, wrinkles and dark things under your eyes so you look a little bit younger or just a little bit more alive. You know, but when you look at the way so many, especially younger women, wear makeup, especially when they're going out, it is just become so extreme, so overdone, ridiculous looking, like eyelashes that they no longer look like someone has just nice long eyelashes. The fake eyelashes now look like, and then a new one that's come out, which I think is fantastic. It so works for me. I love it. Is this fashion trend now where instead of like just using a bit of eyebrow pencil to just kind of accentuate your eyebrows, if you're one of those people that unluckily doesn't have prominent eyebrows and it looks almost, if you're blonde, for example, and your eyebrows are so faint, it might look like you've accidentally waxed them. So you get a bit of eyebrow pencil out just so they're actually visible. No, now the fashion is to make it look like you've got these two giant caterpillars like across your forehead, right? Looks absurd. It looks ridiculous. Anyway, but the reason why all this happens is because women set these social rules about what you have to wear, how you have to look, what's in fashion, what's the trends, and this is now the social pressure they place on other women to do that. And so what maybe started as, oh yeah, wear makeup, it makes you look nicer, now becomes, oh, you have to put these ridiculous fake eyelashes on, you have to massively make your eyebrows just look ridiculous, you've got to wear lipstick that doesn't look like it could possibly be natural, you have to get Botox in your lips blown up to the point where, again, no man thinks, oh, isn't she got gorgeous lips? They now just think, what the happened there, right? This is now all the things that you have to do just to be dressed up nice. And for the majority of women, it places upon them a massive attractiveness cost. The majority of men do not think any of this stuff looks attractive.
Thank goodness someone said it.
Yeah, it's not I've actually got data. Like, I actually bothered to go out and get the data, right? Men do not think this stuff looks remotely attractive, right? And yet the overwhelming majority of women think that it does. So they look at these faces of women done up like this compared to faces of women not done up, and they genuinely think the done up faces look better. The men look at them and go, no, that does not look better. That looks terrible. That looks awful. So what women are doing with fashion trends, whether it's clothes, and the same thing happens with clothes. You know how you see, oh, it's hard to look at. You see these women out sometimes and they're just wearing stuff that is so unflattering. And they're not necessarily women whose bodies are awful, but, you know, unless your body is amazing, then there are certain things you put on that are just going to be so unflattering that you just shouldn't wear them. Right there, you know, you could have a perfectly lovely body, wear a perfectly nice flattering dress, and you're just going to look gorgeous. You don't have to be stick skinny, you don't have to be, you know, a wonderful hourglass shape. You could look lovely. Put that same body in an incredibly unflattering outfit that is tight in all the wrong place, and it just looks terrible. It just accentuates everything you don't want to accentuate and de-emphasizes everything you would like to accentuate, and it looks awful. But women wear these because they're in fashion. And again, when something is in fashion, women think it looks wonderful, even when it looks objectively hideous. So you know how like when you look at photos from, I don't know, like from the 80s or the 90s, I don't know how old you are, so I don't know how far back you need to go to find photos of yourself looking ridiculous. But you go back, you look at old photos of yourself and you look at the hair and you look at the clothes and you just think, oh my God, like, I can't believe that I like looked in the mirror before I left the house and I left the house in that day. Like, that's what I chose to wear. And it just looks ridiculous, right? And that's because we are now looking at that stuff without those items being in fashion. Just knowing that something is in fashion makes us think that it looks great, and that effect is much stronger in women. So women think anything in fashion, they genuinely think it looks attractive. They look at it and it's aesthetically pleasing. And so this is like a trap that women do. And the reason why this works is because the women who are much more attractive, they can afford to wear these handicaps, right? They can wear stuff. The women who are absolutely gorgeous, of course, you know, they can wear things that actually do look terrible on like 95% of the other women, and on them it looks fine because they've got a body that can carry it off. So in some cases they're barely incurring a cost at all for wearing these terrible things, but even to the extent that they are incurring a cost, so even to the extent that, you know, their eyebrows look stupid and their eyelashes look ridiculous, but they're still sufficiently attractive that, you know, even men that don't like any of that stuff can look at them and go, that's, you know, I don't really know what's going on here, but that's clearly underneath all of that is a beautiful woman. So they are incurring some cost, but not a terrible one. All of the less attractive rivals who, you know, these usually socially quite dominant women are influencing to set these trends, and it's their less attractive, less socially dominant rivals who just are forced now to follow these trends, or you're just not keeping up, they're incurring a much bigger cost because of how unattractive these trends are. And so this is why so much of the trends and the things that women do themselves are not flattering. In fact, they're very, very unflattering. And that's just how that works.
Would it be fair to assume that females are more tend to cave into the herd mentality than to be rebellious and stand against and question the trend of where society is headed to as compared to males?
Yeah, 100%. Except I think, like, the statement I think is accurate, but I think the framing might miss a little bit what women are doing. I don't actually think that for the most part women are, like, I forget what the word that you use, something like too scared to go against the herd, or just, you know, more prone. I think it's less about not having the courage to go against the herd mentality. And I think it might even be not even about not being able to see what's wrong with the herd mentality. I don't think that they're less able to see what's wrong, and I don't think that they're necessarily more scared than men to step away from the herd mentality. But I do think that they just have a higher priority on running with the herd because of what that will gain for them than men do. So men are much more driven by meritocratic outcomes, right? Actual real outcomes. If they can see the herd doing something stupid, they're very motivated to go, no, this is stupid. This is not going to be good. This is going to be a bad outcome, and we don't want to do this. And we're going to change direction, and we're going to do something that is going to have a good outcome because we want good outcomes and we are outcomes focused. I think that for women, it's less about wanting good outcomes. It's more like, well, yeah, look, the outcome isn't going to be great, but that's not really going to affect me, though. That's mostly other people's problems. It's not going to affect me. I'm fine. Outcome's not going to be great. This is pretty nasty. Yeah, I mean, again, it's not going to be nasty towards me if I go along with it, though. Like, I'd rather be one of the nasty girls than one of the ones being picked on. So again, it's not going to bother me. And now what do I have to gain by going with the herd? Well, I'm going to get clout. I'm going to get status. I'm going to get rewards. I'm going to get cheered on. I could even be called some sort of, stunning and brave hero, depending on what particular herd I'm running with. I think it's much more that. I think people are very ready to assume that because we know we're not usually meaning to refer to high IQ people when we talk about herd mentality. We're usually implying that these people are just running with the herd because they're too stupid to do anything other than just copy what people around them are doing. And I think that is actually misunderstanding the female motive for running with the herd. I think it's not about not understanding that it's stupid. It's not about necessarily even being too scared. It's just being like, well, these are the benefits I'm going to get if I run with the herd. This is what's going to happen to me if I don't. Pretty easy choice. I think that's pretty much what's going on.
Some a social observation that I've seen is women do care about what affects them immediately, as in the things they talk about. They're not concerned about majority of them, politics or what's happening around the world that's far-fetched, or the war of that country versus this country. They're more concerned about their neighbors, their friends, the gossips, and so on and so forth, which we'll get into right now. As compared to men, they're like they have this whole lens of, okay, if that thing's happening over there, how does it affect me eventually 10 steps ahead? So different mentalities. But would you say it's fair to assume that women, as you said, it's not fair to them to assume that they don't have courage for this, but would you say that would make only some room of them in politics? Because politics is all about that wide lens of things happening far across that's not immediately affecting you, as if you see in America, like if you see the whole political scenario, most women are pro open borders. They're like, oh, well, it's great, let them come in, whatever, so on and so forth. And it's a lot of socialistic behavior. And if you see what's happening in New York right now with the mayor and all of that, it's a lot of socialistic views of everyone's accepted. There's no borders. There's no like structure or society around, which has made New York great. It's one of the major cities. It's very much egalitarian or libertarian, I'd say, versus more like on the conservative side of okay, we can't allow that, having more structure and just some courage to stand against that.
Yeah. So, look, I mean, you're definitely right. And I think like Helen Andrews did a fantastic job of outlining like the feminization of the institutions. And I don't know whether she has said very much about politics in particular, but it's the same. It's exactly the same effects, right? So, she outlined very well the different priorities of women and what it is that they're there to do in the workplace and what it is that they're there to achieve. And so you see these workplaces just becoming less efficient, less outcome focused, more process focused. And what I think is actually, I think that though is not, I don't think that is simply taking women and putting them in a place where they don't belong. It certainly looks like that. They're certainly not as effective as men. They're not as good they're terrible at leadership compared to men on average. They don't produce the outcomes. They produce terrible inefficiencies. They produce counter efficiencies. I mean, that the feminizations of the institutions is an absolute disaster. An absolute disaster. I don't think that there's not a single like load-bearing institution in our society at the moment that is not hopelessly sick. And it is driven by the ideologies that we know are far more heavily supported by women than they are supported by men. And then the things that you're talking about politically, the pro-open borders obviously is a huge one at the moment in the US, and is obviously it's reached it's absolutely at critical apex levels in Europe and the UK as well. But again, we also know that it's not just those particular left-wing views that women are embracing. Actually, women are embracing all of the left-wing views and embracing them to an even more and more extreme end. So if you see the political ideology of young people, men are just tracking along slightly to the conservative side of the middle and haven't really changed. And women have just gone, phew, and, almost to the point where there are no conservative young women. I mean, there's individual ones, but as a proportion of the population, they're just about negligible. They virtually don't exist. So you've just got this population of women that are just screaming towards the far left, screaming towards progressive politics and any kind of progressive ideas. But what is it that these ideas always correlate with? What is it that they are always about? They're about reducing productivity. They're about they're about destroying the family unit. They're about dissolving national borders. They're about removing meritocratic reward and accountability. They're about destroying inverting the pillars of justice, so people begin to get punished for misdemeanors, heavily punished for misdemeanors, while getting either slaps on the wrist or nothing for very serious crimes. So we see a complete inversion of the justice system, and so on and so forth. And what are all these outcomes of these far left policies and ideologies, whether it's socially, institutionally, or economically? What are they? They're the same outcomes that we associate with civilizations that are in decline. We're not seeing women out there running wild and ruining the world. What we are watching is women engaging in mass reproductive suppression, shutting the reproduction of the population down, and then going out into civic society and systematically dismantling each one of the populations and the civilization's load-bearing pillars. It's not an accident. It's not chaos. It looks like chaos, but it's not. It is a very systematic, targeted strategy to bring down. So when civilizations collapse, they don't collapse passively. They shut themselves down. They shut themselves down, pack up, and go home. And that's what's currently happening. The women have walked out of the house, walked away from motherhood, walked away from reproduction, and they are busily shutting society down. They're destroying the education system, destroying the health system, destroying the journalism and the information transfer, destroying civil society, destroying productivity, absolutely decimating productivity, and pushing for every kind of left-wing ideology that is going to further every single one of those. And they're doing it for the exact same reasons that they were embracing feminist ideologies 50, 60 years ago. It's part of that same trajectory. And because the genetic prize at the end is enormous. So if you imagine like a game of musical chairs, right? So I've used this analogy before, but I think it's a good one. Imagine like a game of musical chairs, right? This is what's kind of happening. As women engage more and more in reproductive suppression, every round of musical chairs, someone takes a couple of chairs away, a couple of kids don't get a chair, and then they're out of the game, right? Every round we lose lineages. You know, women do not reproduce and their lineages are out of the gene pool. They're gone, they're finished, they're out of the game, right? When women are in a society where they can detect all of the cues of societal decline, they know that they're at a point in time when they are one of the last ones left. So they can see that things are getting vulgar. They can see that the art and the buildings and the aesthetics are becoming ugly. They can see that the society they're in is very hostile to reproductive success. They can see that it is hostile to meritocratic reward. They can see that they are in a point where the end of the game is really close. Now, here's the thing. If you're in, a game of musical chairs and every round a few more lineages are going to drop out. Well, if you've made it nearly to the end, what do you want to do? Do you want to vote for the game to continue so that more lineages can drop out and maybe you'll stay in it and win? Or do you want to vote to call an end to the game now and you're all winners and you all share the prize? As we get closer and closer to the end, the lineages that remain become more and more motivated to say, let's end it now. Let's call the game done and we'll all be winners. Because the lineages that are there at the end, do you know what happens to those lineages? They become the founding population for the civilization that grows up out of the ashes. What happens when a civilization dies? The people don't die, or at least the women don't die. The men usually do, but the women don't, because other men usually come in. Those other men come in, but the women stay. And the women become the founder population of the civilization that grows up and out. So the genetic prize at the end for suppressing all of your rivals and knocking them all out of the gene pool, but being there at the end means you go from being maybe one lineage among hundreds of thousands to being one lineage among thousands or even only hundreds. And so then as the founder population expands, you go from having a tiny share of the genetic pool in the society you are in to a massive share because you're one of a small number of founders. Everyone in the population will be your descendants. And so that's why this is a cycle, and that's why it keeps happening, because the women who are driving all of the reproductive suppression are also the women who actually end up having children and are the ones who are there at the end of the game of musical chairs. And so their genes are the ones that become the founder genes for the next population, meaning that the next population of women are embedded with all of the genes that will make them behave like this and do this all over again as soon as society becomes safe enough and prosperous enough that they can do something other than spend their whole lives raising children. That's why women are out there breaking everything down. And that is why, yes, if you allow the parliaments of the West to be filled with women, they will continue to simply break everything down.
So would you suggest objectively that, well, these impotent men who have allowed this to happen in the first place on their watch because they have turned themselves into those egalitarian and libertarian views of allowing women and accepting and being accepting of each and every single BS in their lives and now in society, which is what the lower to middle class people have to suffer and go through, but yet these people sit in their gated communities, make all the rules and just, like the puppetry of the whole society. Would you say that it's a time for great reset and we shouldn't allow women in politics?
I think that's really hard because obviously the theoretical implication is that, yes, not only should we not allow, certainly not allow a majority of women into politics. And I mean, and Helen Andrews makes the same comment about having a majority of women in these workplaces, but actually I think it's much less than a majority where the tipping point happens, because when the way women flip workplaces, it's not via a democratic means, right? They don't need to actually be half of the workplace to make it to fundamentally change the way it functions. So you actually want women to not even get close to half. So yes, in theory, of course, we need to get women out of investing all of their time in spaces where, when they invest their time in there, the outcomes are bad, and we need to get them back into spaces where they invest their time, the outcomes are good for society, which means that we need women making families, being mothers, and valuing that role again. Yes, we do. So theoretically, absolutely. However, practically, I think it's a very different, it's obviously a very different situation. So I was having a discussion with someone else the other day about the American movement Repeal the 19th. I mean, it was just a brief discussion, but the American movement Repeal the 19th. And this is the thing, right? Logically you could say, yeah, that was definitely a step in the wrong direction, right? That, that was, one of many, many steps in the wrong direction. And so I certainly understand the motivation behind Repeal the 19th. But if we actually attempted to do that, what would happen? What probably wouldn't happen is a whole bunch of women going, oh, okay, all right, we don't vote then. Very good. But that's not going to happen, right? So I don't think that I don't think you're going to put the genie back in the bottle, right? You're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. That's not going to happen. We are at a point of that civilizational cycle. You can't go backwards. You can only go forwards, right? The cycle doesn't turn back the other way. Even if you were able to do some sort of monumental social engineering to get it to turn back the other way a little bit, the minute you looked the other way or stopped concentrating or let the pressure off, it's just going to keep going back that way, right? That's just where it's going to go. It's the track that it's on, and it's where it goes without you doing any work. And so you need to do tremendous work to bring it back. And I don't think anyone can fight that, which means we're not going backwards, which means we're going forward. And so we know what comes next. We know that the collapse is coming. However, this is the thing, right? Civilizations collapse and die. That doesn't mean that the people within them have to collapse and die. So hard times are coming and big changes are coming, but we are not, that doesn't mean that we have to sit back and let it happen. That doesn't mean that we can't be active agents in what happens and what rises up out of the ashes with the limited number of lineages we have left. And so I think the place that we're in now, the best thing that we can put our time into now is not working out how to undo this mess, because forget it, that the genie's out of the bottle. It's not going back in. We are not going to undo this mess. We don't even live in a world where you can have a conversation like this out in the open public square and not get like absolutely hammered by feminists, right? We are not going to put the genie back in that bottle. It's not going to happen, right? It's a great idea, but it's clearly not going to happen. We have to go forward. And so we have to accept that that's what's coming, and we have to plan for that and work out how we are going to manage that and what we are going to do when, for those of us that come out the other side. That's what's going to happen. We're not going to stop it, but that doesn't mean that we just sit back and go, oh, well, I guess it's over. No.
You said it's a cycle. Assuming
Yes.
the cycle, just me getting on top of my dome, the cycle is a circle. So what goes back around comes back around. So we don't have to go in reverse, but how about we accelerate where we, end up at a very, like a traditionally speaking, at a spot where the civilization expands. Now it's shrinking.
Yeah, that's right. We just have to keep going around. Unfortunately, the what happens between where we are now and getting back around to a point where we become a prosperous, expanding civilization again, that's not a nice part of the cycle, right? So we can't, I don't think we can skip that. I don't think, but we are probably, well, definitely, I would say we are in a position that is far better than the same position than any other civilization that has come before us that has crashed and something new has arisen from the ashes to start again. We're in a much better situation than any of those. We've got a much better idea of what's happening, a much better idea of why it's happening. We're probably able to predict it much better than anyone has before. We've got faster sharing of information and preservation of information. So some of the worst things that happen when civilizations collapse is the culture and the knowledge that is lost. We're in a position to be able to push back hard against actually losing culture and knowledge, because we have the capacity to record in a way that that other societies haven't had. So we do not have to, effectively go back to the dark ages and begin again. We are not, going to lose necessarily the knowledge of our civilization. We're not going to necessarily lose all of the culture of our civilization. But we are in for hard times ahead. We are in for a rocky road ahead. But that's, that's where we're at. There are plenty of other generations who have looked ahead and seen really, really scary things, and they've just gone, oh, well, that's the generation we live in. This is what's going to happen to us. This is going to be the generational, fight of our lifetime and probably our children's lifetime. And hopefully what will come after that will be, times of peace and prosperity for their children. But this is the part of the cycle where we've landed. So point, I don't think we can try and go backwards. I don't think there's any point, whinging about it or lamenting it. It is what it is. So we have to make, like everyone else before us, good times and bad times, we have to make the best of what we've got.
One of the things you mentioned about repeal the 19th, and I believe living in the US, the thing that motivates most young men to repeal the 19th is the ability for selective services. Is only men are drafted in the war, but yet women get equal rights to choose on a politician who's pro-war or isn't pro-war. Like, why? How's that fair?
Yeah.
Why is our lives on lines versus like women get to stay home and just call the shots? Like, okay.
Yeah. And look, that's definitely a huge part of it, and a completely reasonable thing. But I think I think that the implications of the 19th are also, it's much greater than that too. So I was doing a little bit of, because I'm not, oh God, I hate reading feminist literature. I hate it more than you would understand. I can't do it. I've tried, honestly. I cannot sit down and read that stuff, but I did try, and I did go and do some looking at some of the arguments for and against at the time of like the suffragettes and the arguing for women to have the vote and all the rest of it. And what I found really interesting, which wasn't a perspective I'd considered before, and I didn't realize it was something that was even argued at the time until I went and had a look. But actually there was a large population of women at the time who were arguing that, correctly, as it turns out, who were correctly predicting that giving women the vote would be terrible for families. And they were saying that it was wrong to suggest that women's views were not presented at the ballot box. Their views were represented at the ballot box by their husbands, because what was happening is husbands and wives agreed on what was best for their family. And the husband went and represented his family's interests at the ballot box. And it was just a lie to suggest that women's interests were not being represented, because this idea that a married husband and wife would have such divergent views on what was in their best interests and what they wanted. And now it was expected, generally expected, that men would have a better understanding of the ins and the outs of the political situation and who they should vote for in order to get what was best for their family. And obviously, the mother had various other areas of life that she was expected to have the knowledge and the expertise in. But this idea that that women should have the vote, because the implication, of course, is that that men and women vote differently, and why? Well, that a husband and a wife would be voting differently. And like, why would they be voting differently? All of their interests are perfectly aligned. But of course, you fast forward, 100 years, or however long it's, I guess 100 and something years, where it's been. And now it's considered completely normal for husbands and wives to have, have divergent, but you have husbands and wives from opposite sides of the political aisle who are married, but they have completely different votes. And there is something disconnected there when you've got such different worldview outlooks between two people who have invested ostensibly all of their reproductive success. So they've effectively invested everything they have in each other, but they've supposedly got these completely disparate views about what's best for them in the world. And I think what that reflects, and it's reflected in other sort of practices that we see now too, is this idea that husbands and wives are no longer, those types of tight unions anymore. You see husbands and wives maintaining separate bank accounts and separate finances and living as effectively two completely independent economic units that just happen to share a house and children.
That's why I call them wife and wife. It's not husband and wife.
It's so inefficient. It is such an inefficient way to run a marriage. It is such an inefficient way. But actually, it's interesting though that I was doing a study and looking at just women giving advice to other women. So I set up these hypothetical scenarios and I got women to say, what would you do if you were in this scenario? And I also got women to say, what would you advise another woman to do? And predictably, and exactly what I thought would happen, is that women gave other women advice that would be more reproductively inhibiting than whatever that was that they said they would do themselves. So when it was for themselves, it was more pronatal, and when it was for others, it was relatively more antenatal. But what I thought was really interesting about that is that I threw some little marriage inefficiency things in there that I didn't think that other people had noticed or that other people would pick up on. So I didn't necessarily think if those little aspects of the decisions would also exhibit that pattern, but they did. And in fact, they exhibited some of the strongest patterns. So women are actually, because it was a study with only female participants, so I can't say anything about men, but women are very sensitive to marriage inefficiencies and will definitely promote these for other women, but not for themselves.
That brings me continue, sorry.
No, it's just that's it.
That actually brings me to your study, which was one of the best titles in science I've heard. Off with her hair.
Yeah.
You found that competitive women advise other women to cut off more hair. What did you actually do, and what did you find out? Was this the study?
No, that was a different one that I was just talking about. So in this one, what we did, we basically told participants that they had to pretend that they were hairdressers in a salon, and we gave them these little like a client card, I guess. So it had a photo of the client. It ostensibly had, so which the reason why it had a photo was so they could see how attractive the client was. Like that's why we included the photo. We manipulated there to be like highly attractive clients and less attractive clients. So. And we also gave them like a close-up vision of their hair so they could see if their hair was like really nice and healthy or if it was like dry and split ends and needed to be cut. And then we also told them a little thing about what the client said they wanted, like whether they said, I'm trying to grow my hair long, so please don't cut too much off, or actually cut off as much as you like, I don't mind, just cut off as much as you want to to get rid of all the split ends, that's okay, I don't care. And so they were all the things that we manipulated. And basically what we showed is that when the hair was really healthy, so there was no need to cut really any off, and the client said, I'm trying to grow my hair long, so please don't cut too much off, then the more competitive women were, the more they recommended that the client cut off more hair. So we measured how competitive they were. There's like a separate little scale you can give women that basically measures how sort of just intrinsically competitive they feel towards other women. And so what we found is that they cut more hair off, but only if the hair was healthy, because when the hair's unhealthy, then it's a bit tricky, right? Because actually you should kind of cut it off to make it nicer, so it becomes not really clear what the sabotage move is. But when the hair is really healthy, then it's very clear that cutting more off is absolutely like sabotaging them. And the other thing we showed, we did a second study to just replicate the effect and make sure that it came out again a second time, so it's robust. But the other thing we did in the second study, instead of just having more attractive women and less attractive women, we had women from a more range of attractivenesses. a more sort of continuous range, and we got the participants, after they'd given us all of their little bits of hair cutting advice, we then got them to rate how attractive they felt the clients were relative to themselves. So about as attractive as me, more attractive than me, less attractive than me. And what we found is that the women actually cut the most hair off the clients who they thought were about as attractive as themselves. So when they perceived that someone was like at about equal point on like the mate value ladder as them, like is one of their sort of direct rivals, probably after the same type of men that they are, that's when they were most likely to be cutting off the most hair. So it does seem to pretty clearly be a rival sabotage technique, which is, you know, why women always go to the hairdresser and come back terribly upset, because it's not just that, and this is the thing, right? The reason why it's so upsetting is it's not just that you get a haircut you didn't want, or they cut off too much, or whatever it might be. It's not just that. The other thing that makes it upsetting is, I think, that women feel like another woman has deliberately hurt them. Like they actually, they feel upset because, you know, like when you get, you know, like if you get picked on, if you get bullied or whatever, it's not just whatever they say that's upsetting, but it's the fact that someone has targeted you that is upsetting, not necessarily what they actually are saying or doing. It's the fact that you know that they're targeting you that's upsetting, right? And I think that's a similar thing. That's why women get so upset. It's not necessarily just that their hair's an inch shorter than they wanted it to be or that they asked for it, but it's that feeling of feeling like knowing whether it's true or not, whether it was true for that particular hairdresser or not, but it's that feeling of feeling like that was deliberately done to me, that feeling of feeling like someone has done this to me deliberately. And I think that's why women feel like that, because in fact, you know, sabotaging your appearance is one of the things that other women do to you, and that's something that women need to be aware of. And so women are quite sensitive when they feel like another woman has successfully done that.
Fascinating. They, as you said, they do sabotage other women if they're more attractive, if they see them as competition. But you've also said that women's dating advice to other women often contains more self-sabotaging content than those same women would ever follow themselves. That's hell of an accusation, and we have been through the evidence of that. So would you say that's a female version of competitiveness? We established that. Would you say there is a way that women would would have other women self-sabotage themselves so they don't feel like they're confronting with them one-on-one? We've established that as well. So that raises a piece of concern that in the whole liberal community, would you say that's exactly what's happening? Because most of their advice is self-sabotaging. If a woman goes to the other woman, and this is me generally speaking about a relationship, go at it, girl. He's a piece of shit. Like, you know, he doesn't understand you, or you're going a hot girl era, or so on and so forth. All the advice is for women to go out, cheat, and be a hoe. Excuse my language, but that's what it is.
That's what the advice is. The advice is absolutely, it's sabotaging of any current promising relationship that they might have. So I also did a study where we set up, sort of like I described, with a bunch of scenarios and getting women to give advice what they would do, what someone else was doing. It was with ostensibly like a guy who was ostensibly a great catch. So we described him as successful and attractive and wealthy and everything else, right? And basically they went, yep, I'd be in, and sort of told their friends to be a bit more cautious and, you know, all along the way. But we also set it up where he was like a loser. And then we got the reverse effect. All of a sudden, they were much more encouraging of their sort of friends to pursue this relationship. So you get it in reverse as well. When he actually is a loser, all of a sudden, oh no, he seems wonderful. He seems really nice. No, you should go out with him. So yeah, it's sabotaging in both directions. And the like you see it so much in the like, I don't know, the opinion pieces that various women write for different magazines and newspapers, and they talk about, you know, things like, I had an affair and it was the best thing ever that happened to my marriage. It's like, no, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. It definitely wasn't. It definitely wasn't. So basically trying to encourage all these other women out there whose, marriages might be in trouble, whose marriages might be, suffering lack of intimacy or whatever it might be, and saying, yeah, go out and have an affair. That'll spruik your husband back up and make him interested again. Won't. That's not what's going to happen. That's not how that's going to end. Like, it's just, but and then there was another great one, like a little while ago, where some piece talking about how even just having a boyfriend is like right-wing coded. So just the left just becoming, it's gone from, you don't need a man to be financially independent to you don't need men at all. Don't have relationships. Just be by yourself. It's like really cringe having a boyfriend. It's just nuts. It's just crazy. It's just so sabotaging of everything. And even though the encouragement for women to go out and be promiscuous, like, again, like, I'm sure you would be aware, like, a high body count is a red flag for most men. This is not a good thing. Like, you're not, going out and being promiscuous and carefree. Like, not only are they incredibly high risk behaviors, like much higher risk for a woman to do that than it is for a man to do that, just from a straight safety perspective. You're just encouraging really high risk behavior. But even if nothing bad happens in that respect, you're encouraging people to just absolutely trash their long-term mate value, in the eyes of any man who's aware that that's how they're behaving. Like, it's just such counterproductive behavior. It's not especially productive behavior for men either. But it's so incredibly damaging for women, which is why for women, at least, there was always like an inclination to keep it secret. So, this idea that men were going out and having casual sex and that's all fine because they're men and they're players and that's okay. But of course, women weren't doing that. Well, the maths on that doesn't work. If men are out there having casual sex, they're having it with women. Right, unless there's like one woman out there just sleeping with all of the men all the time to allow them to have this casual sex. I mean, basically, if there's casual sex happening, then equal numbers of men and women are having sex with each other, right? Homosexual relationships aside. So it was never the case that men were out there having much more casual sex than women, but men were bragging about it, and women, when it happened, men were probably bragging about it and exaggerating the extent to which it happened, whereas women would not brag about it and would attempt to deny it or at least minimize it because of how damaging it is. And so what's actually changed, as well as like the inclination to potentially have more casual sex, but what has actually changed is this idea that it's something to brag about. That reputational damage that comes, the reputational damage actually comes from the bragging, not necessarily from the act itself, because the act itself only damages your reputation if people know about it. So if the act itself can be kept secret, then it's not damaging. It's the bragging that does all the damage. And then, of course, if you convince women it's a good idea to brag, then they start doing the same thing that the men are doing, which is not just bragging about the casual sex they have had, but they start bragging about the casual sex they didn't actually have, and they start inflating their own body counts because they think that's cool. And now they're just doing themselves all of this damage, and it's not even real. They're not even actually out there having all of this sex. They're just pretending to, which is even, in some ways, is even worse.
I love those women. I'll tell you why exactly. And this is subjective because you're just showing your cards away. It just avoids all the trouble down the line for a man. The hard part is when they aren't honest about it, especially, they have a revelation from Lord and Savior. That's one of the biggest one, and they go and get baptized. That's the common pattern I have observed, and some other religious factors of resetting themselves in the spiritual path, and now you're cleansed and born again a virgin. What's your take on that?
Well, that's interesting. So I haven't heard of that so much. See, religion doesn't have nearly as big a place in sort of Australian, I guess, like regular sort of pop culture as what it has in America. So religion is a much bigger thing in America than it is in Australia. Even for religious people, I think religion is a much smaller thing in Australia. So I can't say that I've ever heard of women, sort of in Australia at least, or that I'm familiar with, like, finding religion to reset the body count. But that same sort of process of just like removing yourself from the social group where you were known for that, and sort of, you know, beginning to dress a bit differently and act a little bit differently and just insert yourself into a new social group so that you can leave that behind. Yeah, I think that's kind of what I think every woman probably does at some point when she realizes that actually, yeah, maybe that's probably not like the kind of person I want to be seen as anymore. If she has been behaving like that, I think there's always going to be some, you know, some mechanism for wanting to make a change, because that's, you know, that just becomes such incredible baggage for women to carry once they realize that it's actually not good. Like once, you know, they get old enough to realize like they've been completely had by their friends and everyone who was encouraged them to do that, and it's actually like, if it's real, it's a horrible way to live, and if it's not real, well, then you just told all these lies that weren't true anyway, and now people think horrible things about you and you didn't even do it. But either way, it's just that, like, I think it's just like what we probably see without the religious aspect, is just women just removing themselves from the social group that they're in and finding a new social group and just leaving that past behind and being a, you know, effectively just sort of being a different person, which in this day and age is a bit hard because things go up on social media and you can't actually get rid of them. So that's kind of that's the other problem that we have now, right? Back in the day, women could have done things even, and it was like his word against hers, right? And so no one actually knew. So he might go and brag to all his mates, and she might turn around and go, what? That never happened. He's such a lie. And then, like, who knows, right? No one ever knew. These days, there's footage, right? So everyone knows exactly what happened and who did what and who said what and when. And that's, you know, women have lost that plausible deniability that we had, you know, in times when things could be secret without witnesses and his word against her word and reputations were never quite sure. Now with, well, number one, women just being encouraged to be open about these things and brag about these things is a problem anyway. But the fact that just so many people just live their lives on their phone and on other people's phones, that there's just photographic or videographic evidence of everything, right? And so once you lose that plausible deniability, then the fact, you know, then the maths of if men are having casual sex, well, women must be having it too. That just becomes a lot more apparent to everybody. It clearly is not a male only activity, right? That doesn't work. So that becomes obvious to everyone then.
How is Australian culture compared to American in terms of promiscuity and women having casual sex just as much men do?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I probably don't know. I probably don't know enough about America to make a direct comparison with America, but I think I can probably tell you a bit about, certainly, like, in terms of Australian culture. I think Australian culture, unlike American, is a lot similar across the board. So I think in America, like, if you were to ask me that question about, like, I don't know, like young women in like California versus young women in like Texas or New York or Wyoming, or, you know, like, it'd be different everywhere, right? Because America has got such this, you know, so many sort of different subcultures within different areas. Whereas I think Australia is a lot less that. Australia is a little bit more the same kind of wherever you go. You know, with some exceptions. But I think in Australia, we sort of have this thing, and it's not just with kids having sex, which I think is probably happens a lot more and a lot earlier than most people realize. But we kind of have this thing in Australia where maybe this is just all countries, and because I'm not like a citizen of every other country, I can't look at any other country from the inside, so I don't know. So maybe it's not unique to Australia. But we have this thing where we have really, really poor insight to the things that we do, and we always like make fun of other countries, right? So, you know, Australia will like make fun of the Irish for how much they drink. Australians drink more than the Irish, right? We'll make fun of the Americans because of how fat they are. Australians are fatter than Americans on average. Yeah. Yeah, we are fatter than Americans. We make fun of Americans because of how litigious they are. Australians have more civil cases, more people suing each other per capita than America does. Or at least it did last time I checked, right? So it's almost like, you know, and I've heard people say, and again, I don't know if this is true, but, you know, we sort of think of the British tabloid press as being like one of the most vicious kind of, you know, press bodies out there, you know, the British tabloids, the ones that killed Diana, blah blah blah. Even though that was in France, but you know what I mean. But I've heard like a few people now say that actually the Australian tabloid press is far more vicious than the British in terms of what they will print about people, the lack of evidence they need to say certain things. And so, you know, we as Australians have these ideas that, oh yeah, the rest of the world is like this and like this, and I don't think we have any clue. Like even crime, like Australians, you know, will all go, oh yeah, you know, Americans and all, they're pro guns and I think they're so clever with their guns and, you know, they got so much more crime. That nuh-uh, we have higher crime rates than America does. Right. So, and guns are illegal, not completely illegal. You can kind of have some if you're a farmer and for certain other reasons, but ostensibly speaking, generally speaking, guns are illegal. We have more crime in America than they have in Australia. I mean, than you guys have in the US. Most Australians are not aware of that. So we have all these things in excess that we just don't know about. And I think it's exactly the same with young people and how much sex they have and the age at which they have it and the ages at which they begin consuming porn and all of those associated things. That is really extreme in Australia. And I don't think Australians, A, realise how extreme it is, or B, even realise that it is more extreme in Australia perhaps than in some comparable other parts of the world. Just like we don't realise how much we drink, we don't realise how much drugs we do. That's another thing. The recreational drugs in Australia, again, other parts of the world are so famous for having, like, you know, being so, you know, in the grip of certain recreational drugs. I don't know if this is still true because my knowledge of these stats is a bit older, but there was a point in time where that was worse in Australia than anywhere else in the world. And we don't seem to be known by the rest of the world for any of these things. Like, I don't think the average American would know that crime in Australia is worse than it is in America. I think that would surprise most Americans to hear as well. So we don't seem to be known for any of these things. And yet that is the reality in Australia. We are excess in so many different domains.
And I'm sure that goes across women having, or people having a higher body count in general, just because sex is so easily available. So
I would think so, yeah.
Going based off what you said. But yeah, coming back to Vogue. Vogue ran a piece saying having a boyfriend is cringe now. And you had a response to that. What did you see in that headline that everyone else missed?
I don't know if everyone else missed it. I think though, I mean, that was the same article, right? If I remember correctly, that went on to say that it was not just cringe, but right-wing coded. Like, it gave a political element to it, I think. I mean, there was a couple of articles, I think, that came out on that theme at the same time. Probably one came out and someone else then wrote, like, got the idea when I'll write one on that too. But I think, it's just this, you know, it's just more evidence of this female reproductive suppression. It's just, you know, it's now moving to younger and younger children, or younger and younger women, to, you know, to now looking at, you know, the young age of women who actually talk about having boyfriends, which is, you know, that to me is a phrase that applies to, like, maybe between the ages of, I don't know, like 15 to 22 maybe. Once you're any older than that, it's not a boyfriend and a girlfriend anymore. Like, you're now, like, it's partners or something. Like, to me that sounds like a very teenagery kind of word. But yeah, it's just that movement towards, and it's not just anti-natal, it's becoming anti-relationship, and it's also morphed just into anti-male as well. So I saw this was a UK survey, I believe, that that they did, might have even been like one of those YouGov ones, I'm not sure, but I am pretty sure that it was UK, and it reported something horrendous, like it was more than 50%. Some majority of women reported that they just found men disgusting. Like, they just as a group, they just found men or maybe not just, maybe repulsive, like just generally repulsive. Like, they just did not like them, didn't want to be around them, didn't want anything. And you know, this is the environment in which these, you know, young men and young women are growing up, and at the point of their life where they should be, you know, partnering up and, you know, looking for ostensibly someone who will end up being a long-term partner. And you've got large chunks of the female population either being of the view that you know, just having a boyfriend is like politically cringe, like I just wouldn't do it, or I just hate men, they're all just disgusting, or I don't need a man because I'm just going to be independent, or I'm never going to have a family, I'm just going to live like my child-free life and travel forever and just be, you know, and just be wonderful until I'm like old and 70 and alone. It's just all, I hope it's reaching, well, I hope it's reaching some sort of a crescendo and hasn't got much further to go, but I also don't think that it's necessarily going to let up. So I guess it is just going to keep going. I can't see anything reversing the trend, right?
It's, yes. Have you made an observation in society in general? It's like, as a bandwagon, you all want to hop on the new trend. As the fashion we talked about the culture, you know, sleeping around now, bragging about, you know, how many partners you've had. Maybe this is one of those. And just basically looking at, okay, these elites of these big companies, big corporations is also one of the reasons that people have lost interests and their trust in these big organizations, and these organizations have lost their credibility, especially after COVID, the way they exploited people in that use misinformation, fear and greed, so on and so forth. Maybe this is reaching a tipping point where now the information and credibility of these big organizations have decentralized towards people like me and you, perhaps, where we can actually talk about it. Your whole study, your whole career, you have basically a whole chapter of your work that's why it's unsayable. Why is female competition the one thing we're not allowed to talk about? Because I don't think big organizations or like these big podcasts on Netflix, you know, they're funded by a certain group of people to just promote their certain agenda. They're making money, of course, but again, it's not helping people. It's more of sugarcoating, word porn, and satisfying what people need to hear. Because you sit down, like you read feminist books, you know, you sit down and you're like, okay, I wasted my hour. What did I get out of this? Nothing. It's basically word circle jerking off each other on the mic, basically. So tell me more about why the society, or why you have come to conclusion that female competition is something that people don't talk about, and why do you think it's unsayable?
I think it's the exact same reason that it's so unallowed to be anti-abortion as well. So, and in fact to say anything that goes against the feminist doctrine. And this is the thing, right? So we have all these individual little ideologies, and they kind of get ridiculously extreme, and they reach a sort of point, and then they just can't be sustained, right? That the COVID story just could not be sustained any longer, because aside from anything else, the population was exhausted. Even if it was true, even if COVID was potentially sort of as serious as they were saying it was going to be, and the lockdowns were going to be justified, people actually just went like, I've had enough of this. Like, I'm just not doing it. Like, we're just going to go out and we're going to get COVID and we're going to get sick, and some of us are going to die, and we're going to get on with our lives. Like, they just, you know, you can only sustain that kind of like intense ideology for so long. And we're seeing the same thing at the moment with the gender ideology as well, right? It's reaching some sort of a crescendo where it's just getting to the point of ridiculous, and then, you know, it's just becoming a bit too visible, and a few too many people are looking at it and going, that's bonkers. He actually just said the phrase her penis. What is this shit, right? And then it begins to, like, it just loses its shine, and it loses its appeal, and it can't sustain. But there's another ideology though that hasn't lost its shine and isn't about to, and that's the feminist one. And people don't realize, I don't think, the extent to which it is an ideology that bears so many of the hallmarks of all the others that have come and gone. So there are so many conversations I have with people, whether it's about like the gender pay gap, or whether it's about women's roles in institutions, or whether it's about some other sex difference or something else. And so many people, men and women, even when they want to disagree with the feminist doctrine, they preface it with, oh, look, obviously, I'm all in favor of women's rights, but, and it's like, that's what the cultists say, right? Obviously, I'm not a transphobe, but, obviously, I need to pay my homage to this ideology, but, so that they're allowed to make a criticism. And you've got women acting and behaving in extraordinary ways that make no sense. And people just go, oh, okay, that's fair enough. Like the French government a couple of years ago, or I don't know, maybe I'm not good at keeping track of time, maybe a year ago, they announced a program where they were going to provide free fertility testing for young women because, like everywhere else in the world, women are delaying having children. And what's happening is by the time they decide they want children, they're already in their early 30s. And if they've got fertility problems, well, that's when they discover it, when they've got very few reproductive years left. And so the French government had this idea they were going to offer free fertility testing to all young women, so that at least those young women knew that if they were going to find it difficult to get pregnant when they were in their 30s, they knew that now in their 20s, and maybe they could start trying sooner, or maybe they could, at least know that it wasn't going to be easy. So they couldn't just leave it till they were 35, cross their fingers and hope for the best. The feminists went absolutely nuts. How dare the government provide this service free for women? We didn't ask for this. We didn't demand for this. We want, we want all these other services. All these other services are so much more important. And I think eventually the end result was that they didn't introduce it. They dropped it. They dropped the program because the feminists jumped up and down and screamed about it. And this is the same reason why we will also never have a serious conversation, just like we can't have a serious conversation in society about abortion. I mean, we have in a lot of jurisdictions around the world, but currently every single jurisdiction in Australia, abortion is legal right up until the point of birth for any reason. And we currently have some parliaments that have put a moratorium on even tabling any bills that have anything to do with abortion, so that it can't be discussed in the parliament, because they know that they're snookered. They know that they can't stand up in the parliament and speak on the record in public and say, I'm in favour of aborting babies at 39 and a half weeks. But they also know that they can't stand up in parliament and say, I'm in favour of not letting women abort babies at 39 and a half weeks. It's a conversation that can't be had. As a politician, you are snookered. Both of those opinions are considered absolutely morally abhorrent by different sections of the community. So it is not a conversation that can even be had. And so that's how some parliaments have solved it. And, other parliaments are just vote the legislation down or refuse to. There's, the state parliaments of work in different ways, but they can sort of vote to refuse to even debate the legislation, so it can be entered as like a private member's bill by a single person, because none of the major parties would ever go near it, but a single private member's bill could enter it, and then the major parties just vote to make sure it doesn't even get discussed, because they can't debate it. It's literally not debatable. There is absolutely nothing that you can say about abortion and not get absolutely skewered by either feminists on the one hand or sensible people on the other hand. It's absolute poison for a politician, it's kryptonite. And for exactly the same reason, we will never be able to have a sensible conversation about birth rate decline, because just like abortion, birth rate decline is actually it's not a side effect or just something that's happening. It's the whole point of the game. It's promoting abortions and making sure that women don't have babies and declining the birth rate is the whole point of the game. Feminists don't have to consciously be aware that this is what's happening, but they hear about the French government offering free fertility treatment and they begin frothing at the mouth. And then they start thinking of reasons why they should be so angry, and then they start voicing the reasons they thought of. That's not the actual reasons why they're angry. The reasons why they're angry because here is a government that is trying to help young women have babies when, these feminist women are doing everything in their power to stop young women from having babies. That's why they're angry. But they have to voice some logical, confabulated reason that seems to account for their anger. And so they start telling the government how there are so many more important things they should be doing for women, and how dare the government decide that motherhood should be women's sole priority, which of course is nonsense, as if this one little program is somehow pushing out all of other female priorities. It's a ridiculous argument, but people let them make that argument, and no one stands up to make the counter argument, because nobody wants to be on the receiving end of that kind of wrath. And so we have a situation where we are absolutely, as a society, completely beholden to feminist ideology. And most people don't even realize it. Most people don't even realize how beholden we are to it, and how unwilling they themselves even are to voice things that are anti-feminist because they feel uncomfortable with the feminist position. So they wrap everything up in all these, oh, I'm a feminist, and of course I support women's rights, and of course blah, 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 but here's this like little opinion I have. And then someone says, oh, really? And they go, oh, yeah, oh, I don't know, maybe, and step back from it almost straight away, right? We cannot, as a society, I don't think that we actually have the capability. On the whole, there are individuals within it who can have these conversations. We can have these conversations, plenty of other people having these conversations. But on the whole, in terms of what's going to be the publicly endorsed elite, elite supported public discourse, it is never going to be about the actual real problems that we face, because all of those problems that we face, they're not side effects, they're not issues. Their system working as intended. They are standard operating procedure. They are not, the productivity decline is not the problem to be solved. It's the goal. It's the point of the game. The birth rate decline is not a problem to be solved. It's the point of the game. And as long as we are this beholden to feminist ideology, we will never solve the birth rate decline, or the productivity problem, or the porous borders, or any of the others.
The bigger question is, why are these impotent men, when I say impotent, it's just a curiosity of not standing up against these ideologies and starting and listening to these feminists, extreme feminists in the first place. Why do you think that is? Like, why do we have to listen to them and entertain that fact in the first place?
Because they've got sisters and daughters and nieces, and they have all of the same genetic interest in playing this game as the women do. It won't be their genes, but it will be their lineage. So they're under all the same. So the women that have been under selection pressure to shut society down once they perceive all of the social cues around them that this is the stage of civilization that we're at, men are largely programmed to let them do it. And so they do.
As a scientist, what's the finding in your field that you feel like you can't really say out loud without your career taking a hit?
Oh, look, I think the biggest one, and it's not something that I've ever personally researched myself, but probably the biggest one is probably the race IQ. So that is probably the single biggest finding, that I think there are plenty of perfectly reputable scientists out there who actually genuinely think that they're not political, who actually think, who probably fancy themselves as being a little bit heretical and not, following the data and doing the right thing and not getting caught up in all the fads, who still believe that all of those data are just purely a reflection of the racist researchers who collected them, and thus we don't need to deal with it or contend with it or discuss it or understand what it implies about anything at all. I'd say that's probably that would have to be the one. I'm not sure if there's another that is as poisonous as that, I think.
But it's true though.
Yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. That's irrelevant. That has not been relevant to the academy for longer than I've been in the academy. So I remember when I was very junior, when I was still doing my PhD, and I was very naive, and I was horrified, absolutely horrified, to discover that there were these things called feminist researchers who actually, so way back, early in my career, some of the first studies that I did on humans was looking at sex differences in spatial cognition. So one of the biggest cognitive sex differences that there is that men excel in like probably most types of spatial cognition, and there's a few types of spatial cognition that women excel in, and those sex differences are huge. Like, you don't need to get very many men and very many women into a sample and compare them, and the sex differences are massive, right? And they were some of the first things that I was looking at, and I was absolutely horrified to discover that there were, you know, these supposed feminist scholars dedicating huge amounts of time and effort in attempting to bring down that whole research paradigm and accuse everyone who did any research on it of being just horribly sexist, because of course they just decided that it was all about, they just conveniently ignored the bits of spatial cognition where women always outperform men, and they just focused on the bits where men outperform women and accused all the researchers of being sexist, misogynists, and tried to explain how all the data were just because of this reason, all that stupid reason. It was all nonsense, utter nonsense. And I was appalled to think, how could anyone, because back then I didn't have anything like the actual understanding of what feminism actually is that I have now. I was never a feminist. I was very effectively inoculated against that growing up, because I had people very close to me who were like, I don't know, I guess you'd probably call them unsympathetically like rabid feminists, I guess you might say. So I grew up with the worst brand of feminism, right? And I wasn't remotely impressed by it at all. I was just like, right, okay, well, they're obviously a bunch of idiots. So I was never a feminist. I never fell for that, and I got pretty good. The other thing too that was sort of part of my growing up as well is that I had a reasonably highly educated family and some other key people around me, and also if you add then the feminist into that, is that, you know, I was held to account a lot for not agreeing with certain things other people said, and so I had to actually learn how to articulate my disagreement. So like it or not, I was forced to actually think about why I disagreed and what was wrong. So, you know, I sort of had this very silly idea that feminists were, you know, had women's interests at heart, number one, fundamentally wrong. And also, number two, that they were just really stupid, also fundamentally wrong. But I just thought that there were people that had women's interests at heart, but were just fundamentally stupid and just completely misunderstood how the world worked, misunderstood how, like, humans work, and just were completely misguided. But yeah, I was horrified to discover that there was this field, and that they were winning. That was the other thing. They were winning. And then there were other sort of findings in evolutionary psychology that these feminist scholars began attacking, and they began winning those as well, to the point where people didn't study them anymore. And it would almost become like a public virtue signal to say, oh no, yeah, we don't believe any of that research. We don't think any of it's replicable. And it's like, well, it was replicable for 15 years until people were told they were sexist for doing it, and now no one does it anymore. Where's the non-replicable bit? Like, what are you on about? So I was horrified to discover that. But then I realized that was nothing. That's nothing compared to, like, at least that is a field where, you know, they're looking at sex differences between men and women. Some of that is like cognition, which I guess you could sort of say is kind of a little bit like intelligence. So it's kind of like saying men are smarter than women. So I guess if you're really stupid, you could maybe think that was actually sexist, maybe. But that's got nothing on other fields. Like the absolute nonsense that comes out of fields that should have absolutely no political influence at all. They have no political implications, and yet they do. I've seen people fighting about the politics of human mating system, of animal mating systems, as though what some species of lizard does has any moral implication for anything. And I've seen people like grown adult scientists fighting about that at conferences. It's mental. It's mental. So this, you know, the academy has been infected by, you know, a massive left-wing bias that has been morphing into extreme leftist ideological views that have been impinging on science well outside of the social sciences that we're all kind of familiar with, like we all kind of know that nonsense, right? But well outside of the social sciences, and even outside of the sciences that kind of share borders with the social sciences. It's in all these different fields as well. So the academy hasn't cared about what's actually true for a very long time, and it's been subject to sort of cancel culture and condemnation for a very long time. And the thing about the way it works, I don't know how much this is actually true, but this is definitely how people perceive it. And that is that people perceive that if they say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, then someone who is very well connected will be on a grant panel for a grant that they need, and they're just not going to be able to get it, and they're not going to be able to get their paper published. Now, my experience of actually being on grant panels and being an editor at a journal is that the overwhelming majority of times the authors and the reviewers don't know each other of papers and of grants, and everything is people attempting to make their best decision about reviewing something and trying to be accurate. But there is certainly this perception, and I'm sure it happens in individual instances, there's certainly this perception that if this person at this conference hears you say that, then that person will make sure that you never get that grant. And so the fear of saying the wrong thing, like coming out and being stupid enough, for example, to say something like, yeah, well, of course there are IQ differences between different races. Not only will that sort of leave you an effective pariah at that conference for the rest of the conference, people will be convinced that that will also mean that you can never publish in certain journals again, and you will never be considered for funding by certain granting bodies again. And look, maybe to some extent that's true. I can't honestly say that I've ever seen that for myself, but that is the perception and the fear that people feel. And I suspect to some extent it probably does happen. I'm sure there have been occasions where a particular person has found themselves reviewing a paper or on a grant panel and gone, oh, goody, now's my opportunity to get someone back. But I don't know how often it happens, but that's the fear, and that fear has been bringing people into line for decades and stopping them from saying certain things for decades and costing people careers for decades, and making sure people can't get tenure because they study the wrong thing, and so on and so forth.
And would you be afraid to let people know on this pod, like, if you have to put the race IQ in category from the highest to the lowest, what it would be?
Oh, well, it's Asian, white, black, basically, and then there's other races as well, but Asian's highest, like Southeast Asian, Japanese type, and then white, and then black.
White, black.
Everyone,
everyone knows that.
Yeah, it's not a secret. It's replicated every time somebody tries to go out and measure it. It gets replicated in every single data set you care to look at. You can see the evidence of it, whether you look at university entrance scores or high scores. And look, we can have, there's many discussions we can have about what causes it. And there's many discussions we can have about the interplay between culture and genes and the rest of it. But the fact is that the effect is not going away. You can't make it go away. It's sufficiently big and robust and happens all over the world. It's obviously not going anywhere, right? There's no point pretending that it doesn't exist. And one of my biggest gripes with people who, not so much the people that are just too chicken to say it. Fair enough. I don't think that that's a great, I don't think that's a great attribute if you're just too chicken to say something that is true. But okay, fine. I'm sure there's, I'm sure that, you could put me in a particular scenario where I might just keep my mouth shut. But okay, well, whatever. I'm not going to judge someone for that. But the people who actually will insist that this isn't true, and then say, well, it can't be true because, the implications of this for human rights. And it's just, it's not, it's racist to say that this race has got a lower IQ than that race. And it's like, well, hang on a minute. But the only way that any of what you're saying could possibly actually make sense is if you actually think that someone's IQ does determine their worth as a person. If you actually think that someone with a lower IQ is actually worth less than someone with a higher IQ, Otherwise, why would you have a problem with Asian people having a higher IQ than white people and white people having a higher IQ than black people if you don't think that actually implies something about human worth? Like the person who's got a problem with actually, you know, making judgments of other people about their worth based on IQ is you, because you're so offended by this that you want to make it away. I don't have a problem with it. There are, you know, there are certainly, you know, Asian people with a higher IQ than me. There are white people with a higher IQ than me. There are black people with a higher IQ than me. You know, I certainly don't have the highest IQ on the planet. In fact, men have higher IQs than women. That's another one that no one knows about that you're not allowed to say. Men have a slightly higher IQ than women. So there are, you know, even more men that have a higher IQ than, you know, than women that have a higher IQ than me. So what? Like, what does that mean for, like, me as an individual? That I am part of a group, you know, I mean, aside from anything else, that the way IQs are, you know, are kind of measured and the way they're normed, you know, the majority of people are ostensibly part of a population that has a mean IQ of 100. That's not very bright. We're all in a group where the mean IQ is 100. So what does it matter if this particular group has a mean that's a bit above 100 and this particular group has a mean that's a bit below 100? Doesn't mean anything for you as an individual. If your IQ is, say, I don't know, 123 or 114 or 98, what does it matter what group you're in? It doesn't change your own IQ. Like, you don't have an IQ of 103 if you're white, but then if you're black, it's going to go down to 95. Like, no, you have an IQ of 103. And you have some number of white ancestors, and you might even have some number of black or Asian ancestors in the background too that you don't even know about. But what makes no difference to you as an individual person. And so if you think that talking about, like, IQ differences between any group, whether it's men and women or races or whatever, if you think that you know, means that you're automatically devaluing one group, well, then you're the problem, because you think that IQ somehow determines people's value as a person. You know, like, what do you think about people whose IQ is terribly low? What value do they have as people to you? Like, you're getting all upset because, you know, there might be 5 or 6 or 10, whatever, I don't even know what the difference is, you know, magnitude IQ point differences between that group and that group. What the hell do you think about people whose IQ is 60? How much compassion do you have for them? Like, what are they worth anything to you? Do you think we should even look after them as a society? Like, where is your head at to think that this has anything to do with human value? Like, it blows my mind. And yet they get away with making the people who are just wanting to understand the data feel like they're the ones that have got the problem with humanity, that they're the ones who have got the problem somehow with you know, seeing everyone as being of equal worth, just for being honest about the data and just for looking at it and for wanting to understand it. It's nuts.
Asians have the highest IQ. Number 2 is Caucasian people, and third is black. But I guess there's another deeper level to the study which I have discovered. I'm sure you have as well, because you're seemingly deep into it. What is a chimpanzee's IQ? I think with 50 to 60 or something. Like, it's 55 to 60, somewhere along that line. And there's a descendant of Africa, of African descendant people, where their IQ is right 5 points above a chimpanzee. And I'm referring to Somalians in that case. And that's just not me making it up. It's just because, firstly, their skull structure have a smaller brain. And secondly, you're like, why not have compassion for those people? Actually, I'd like to push back on that and just say, I think America did have compassion on that by allowing a certain number of immigrants from Somalia and a lot of illegal migrants. But I don't know if you've heard of the Somalian Minnesota fraud that's been going on. It's pretty famous. Yeah. So it kind of contradicts me saying that their IQ is that number, which is 5 points above a chimpanzee, but yet they were able to defraud a government that huge with millions of dollars. Would that person with a low IQ be able to do that?
My suspicion is that the Somalians that actually emigrate and make it somewhere else, because again, the IQ is like the average, right? So my guess is that the Somalians who manage to migrate will probably not be the ones of the average IQ of the population. They will probably be a bit higher. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're geniuses, because I don't think that you need to be a genius to have been defrauding. We've got I don't know that they're from Somalia, because we have got obviously like different migration flows in Australia, but we have a similar problem in Australia. We have a system called the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and we are now starting to see rumblings about there being just massive amounts of fraud in the way that scheme is operated. And again, the fraud appears to be concentrated in certain migrant groups. And so what you've got again is you've got people coming in to a country and taking full advantage. And I think part of the reason, well, I think this is actually a little bit naive, but I'll explain it anyway and then explain what I think the other thing is. Part of the reason why they're able to do that is because we set up systems that assume a certain level of compliance from the population. So, so one of the issues, this is a better example, one of the issues in America at the moment is whether or not people should be showing ID to vote. And there's lots of concerns around, what is the extent of voter fraud? What is the extent of, fiddling in elections? Is this a tiny issue? Is it a moderate issue? Is it in fact a massive issue? And there's a push to try and get people to have to show ID to vote. In Australia, you don't have to show your ID to vote. So in Australia, you just walk into the voting booth and you vote. And what they have are these great big, giant, like the old-fashioned phone books, right? And so the little person sits there at their desk and you walk up to them. I love the look on your face. You walk up to them and you tell them your name, and they get the little book and they get their ruler and they find your name and, oh, you're here to vote. Very good. So they cross you out, because in Australia, voting is compulsory, right? So if you don't vote, you'll get fined. So you've got to get your name crossed out. But there isn't one voting booth per electorate. So in your electorate where you go to vote, there might be 20 different voting booths. So in theory, you could go to 20 different voting booths on voting day, and anyone could do this. You could go to 20 different voting booths and vote and get your name crossed out in each book. Now, you'd get found out, because at the end of the election, they get all the books together and they fine anyone whose name didn't get crossed out in any book, because voting's compulsory and you didn't vote, so you get your little fine in the mail. But if your name also got pulled out more than once, then you would also get fined, because you're not allowed to vote more than once. Now, Australians don't have an issue with voting fraud at the moment. That method works quite fine. We don't have situations where we get to the end of elections and they look at the books and there's just hundreds and thousands of people voting 3, 4, 5, 10 times at all these different voting booths around the traps. It just doesn't happen. That doesn't mean, though, that in the future it's not going to become a problem. That doesn't mean that in America right now, where there are big pushes for ID to vote, that it's irrelevant and it's obviously not a problem. It could be a massive problem in America just because it's not in Australia, right? It's a different culture. And so we have these systems, and these systems are set up in order to work for the people that they're designed to serve. And that assumes that those systems have to assume a certain level of compliance, right? And so we have systems in the West that are set up and they're designed and built into the systems, even if it's not recognized formally that it's been built in, but built into the systems is this implicit assumption of compliance and an implicit assumption of honesty and an implicit assumption that people will not rort the system. The fact that in both Australia with the NDIS and in Minnesota with the whatever their disability scheme is called, we're seeing these massive rorts, and it seems in both instances that it's coming from migrant groups. That tells us a couple of things, right? The fact that the fraud is happening means that it's possible, means these systems are actually pretty easy to fraud and they're being frauded on a massive scale. But the fact that the people doing the frauding are not the local population means that the system's been implicitly designed to suit the local population who would not be compelled to defraud on that scale. They're actually quite easy to defraud. Going to different voting booths on the one day is trivially easy. Like yes, you'll get caught, but they don't know which votes are yours. Your 20 votes will still count. So if you organise a big group of people and you all go and vote the one way, you can get a particular candidate in, you'll all get fined, but so what? Your candidate gets up, that's worth it, isn't it? Right? So, but it doesn't happen. Right? Now, it could happen. And when it starts happening and they start seeing evidence of it, Australians will then be required to produce ID as well. But at the moment, that hasn't happened yet. So this is the thing, right? These systems are set up and they assume a level of compliance that matches the population they were set up for. That makes them prone to to fraud from people who simply do not have respect for the system, who do not have that level of compliance. They become incredibly easy to defraud because the necessary checks and balances to prevent that scale of fraud are not built into the system, because the system was not built for a population where they considered that level of defrauding would happen. And in some extent, the fact that we're seeing it in people who are not sort of, natives of that population, for perhaps want of a better term, tells us that in some senses those design decisions were justified, because the people they were designed for are not the ones doing the defrauding. So this is the problem when you let in large numbers of immigrants from cultures with different values, different norms, different morals, and different settings, and you let them in, and you let in a lot of them, and you let them in quickly, too quickly for there to be cultural assimilation. You let them in quickly enough that they actually can form their own subcultures and thus maintain the norms and the morals and the standards of the cultures they came from. So I was reading something about Indians the other day, like people from India, the other day, and it wasn't something I'm familiar with, and I can't remember what the word was, so I won't even try and pronounce it. But it was talking about this particular value in Indian culture, and it may not be like, I don't want to insult Indians if someone Indian out here is like, that's not an Indian thing, what is she talking about? It might be a sub part of India, I'm not sure, but anyway, was talking about this particular like value where it's considered like a good thing if you get away with cheating a system. Like if you manage to cheat a system and get away with it, it's not like, oh, that's like, no, you've now like basically ripped all your fellow men off. It's like, oh, well done, clever. Well, that was clever, well done, you got away with it, good work.
I can like, confirm that, actually, being from that society. You're right.
Right. And so if you let in a whole bunch of people into a world where systems are not designed to be resistant to being defrauded, because the people there do not believe it's okay to defraud systems on the most part, and you let in a huge number of people who actually think that's perfectly fine and in fact think it's to be applauded, what's going to happen? Of course, the systems are going to get defrauded, not because these people are especially smart and savvy, but because the systems just don't have that. They weren't built to defend against that. And then you add the extra layer of, I don't think we currently have governments and institutions in place who are trying to defend against that. That's the other thing. It's not just that they're not built with this implicit trust. I think that the fragility of these systems is more a feature than a bug, is the other kind of cynical side of it. I think they're actually building systems that they know are highly vulnerable, and then but knowing that, certain groups of people will not exploit those vulnerabilities, but other groups of people will. And so they're creating systems that are actually highly vulnerable. I don't actually think it's just an unfortunate accident. I think it's a little bit more by design. But there you go.
Correct. That is how it's seen upon in the Indian culture and the Indian society, of like, oh, wow, like you got away with it. Because it's always like me versus the government, because in India, it's like the system isn't systematic. It's based and relied on connections and your political connections of what you can finesse, how much you can finesse, having political connections to, get away with a lot, not pay taxes, so on and so forth. So that's looked as
the entire system is gaming. Like that actually is the system. The system is how well you can game the system. That is the system.
You're right. But for some reason, we haven't seen statistically Indians defrauding in the West, in the Western countries. They're one of the that's kind of surprising to me, because I believe the Indians aren't good at making a system, but they're definitely good at following one. As in, if their system was so good, if they were so good at making a system, well, they would have done it for their own country. But no, everyone wants to come to the West. But guess what? Yeah, they want to come to the West, be a follower of the system made by quote unquote white people or Caucasians or the West in that regards. Name any big country in Europe, in Australia, America, the North America, whatever. It's all like, oh, they're really good at following the system, and now Indians are number one in terms of holding monetarily wealth as a part of a community, even though they're small in amount. So that's a very unique observation that I have come to observe.
That's interesting. I wonder if a part of that is the relief of a system that doesn't require gaming it to succeed. Like, I imagine that living in a world where it's like, it's quite dog eat dog, right? If you're in a world where everything you get is because you've managed to game the system, or you've managed to know someone, or you've managed to impress someone, or to please someone, or whatever it might be, I imagine that's a relatively like stressful way of having to get about in the world. I wonder if there is an appreciation for a system where none of that is needed. It's just, it's fair, it's black and white, you do this, you get this, and that's how it works, and no one takes it away from you, no one decides you're not having it. I wonder if that actually makes it like an appealing system. And so I wonder if that contrast actually is like, you're like coming out of a world where it's so socially hostile and you've just got to be thinking about these things all the time, into a world where it's just like, oh, I just don't have to worry about that shit. I just do what I meant to do. I get what I meant to get, and it's great. Like, I wonder if that is kind of part of it. It's just a relief to not have to do that.
Yes, in fact, that is quite what it is. Because firstly, I think the bar of entry for Indians to go and assimilate, to go into a country is very high. Let's say you have to have, I guess, in Indian currency or something like $200,000, $300,000 to actually move into the country and migrate for international students and so on and so forth. From what I know about the community is they sell their lands and they sell their properties, their assets off to send their kids out. And because the bar of entry is now or they take massive amounts of loans to send their kids out to the country. So there are a lot of peer pressure and societal pressure and parental pressure on them to make it in the country, which is being a good citizen. And it's a lot of on that verge of like, oh, I'm not going to commit a fraud or, act heinously or commit a crime because I'm going to get kicked out. That's
and then my family spent all that money for nothing to send me over here, and I've just ruined it.
Yeah, basically. So I believe that's a big factor in majority of them. But touching base, you look at surrogacy, abortion, even assisted dying through the lens of a long-term civilization,
I know.
Sustainability. That's a very cold lens and a very hot topic for some people out there. What does it lead you? Where does it lead you?
I find the whole assisted dying thing incredibly dystopian. It's just it boggles my mind. And maybe about 20 could it be that long? Maybe 20 years ago, I think, we had a bit of an assisted dying debate in Australia for a little while, and I think that if I remember correctly, I think that culminated in assisted dying being allowed in the Australian Capital Territory, which is a little bit like Washington, D.C. It's very small. It's just a territory and not a state. And it's around the capital, and it's sort of where all the politicians are. And they have their own rules because they're not part of any of the states, and they frequently have like very different rules to the rest of the country. And they often do things like, it's kind of like the ACT that decides to do something first frequently to see how it goes, and often not that well. Anyway, I think if I remember correctly, it was that was the context of the debate anyway. And the debate, I think, like, as I remember it, so, through my own lens, but was very much framed around, like, there are people with, horrible terminal illnesses who currently endure awful, horrible, painful deaths, that their families have to witness if they don't want these people to die alone. And the only way that we can stop that from happening is to allow assisted dying. That's like one half of the debate. And the other half of the debate, remember I said that religion doesn't really loom very large in Australia? Well, the whole other half of the debate was basically framed as, it's basically stopping that unnecessary, awful suffering of people, in their last moments, versus people who just think that we shouldn't do it because the Bible says it's wrong. So, very much completely belittling and using religion to belittle the anti argument. And that was basically how the debate was framed. And not surprisingly, I think a large number of Australians were sort of therefore on the pro-assisted dying side because that was the way it was sold. And there was no sophisticated discussion about, any of the issues that actually matter around this. And so to have exposure to that, and to hear all of the people talking about, like, you know, the slippery slope argument and who it's going to be extended to, and have all those people just be referred to as, you know, ignoramuses, of course, because all of the elite just love telling anyone who uses a slippery slope argument that that's a logical fallacy. And it's like, yeah, we're not making a logical argument, we're making an argument based on analogy. We've seen what fucking humans do, and the fact is that if you let them do this, they'll do the next thing, and if you let them do that, they will do the next thing. It's not a logical argument, it's an argument based on like experience. We're not using logic to say that this logically has to happen, we are just saying this is what humans will do. Like, that's different. Anyway, so having seen that introduction to it, and then see it get, and I don't even know if it's even legal now. I don't know if I think it did get introduced in the ACT. I don't know if it got overturned. I actually don't even know. That's how much it is not an issue in Australia. But anyway, the seeing it happen in Canada, and to a lesser extent, like the Nordic countries, but we don't get as much news about those. Like, I think we see a lot more of what's happening in Canada, I think just because it's English speaking, and so you just see more of it, right? It's just absolutely, utterly horrifying. It is absolutely, utterly horrifying. Every single thing that the people who were accused of just mounting slippery slope arguments said has come true, and worse, and much worse. It is utterly horrendous. And they've just reintroduced they killed the assisted dying bill in the UK a couple of months ago, and I don't know which clown has reintroduced it, but somebody has now brought it back to the UK Parliament. They're going to have to debate it again, or I don't know. They got rid of it, and they got rid of it in the House of Lords. I don't know the UK system well enough to know what's happened, but it's back. So they're going to have to sort of go through all that over again. But that bill is absolutely, utterly horrendous as well. And I think because they've got the Canadian example to work from, because because like they all start with, oh yes, it's just for terminally ill people, and it's just for like terminally ill people whose, you know, sort of expected death is very near. And then it's for this extra group, and then it's for this extra group, and then we're going to extend the time. Now it's going to be for kids, and now it's going to be for kids with their parents' agreement, and now it's going to be for kids down to this age without their parents having to agree, and now it's just horrendous. And I think because like the UK have watched Canada just spread out, and so their draft legislation, or at least the previous version that I paid a little bit of attention to, it was honestly like something out of a horror movie, listening to the people in favor argue for why people who are, you know, people with intellectual disabilities should necessarily be given, you know, the ability to choose assisted dying. It's almost impossible, if you haven't actually heard it, to think that they're actually making those arguments. You know, people who we know have, you know, a very limited capacity to properly understand the difference between like now and an action and a consequence and tomorrow. And yet they're arguing for these people to be able to select assisted dying and calling it like some sort of medical treatment. And the other thing that I only recognized long after that sort of period of time in Australia where that debate was kind of the thing that people were talking about, and that is just what a lie it is to be framing these people who are dying these horrible deaths. Like, I don't know what happened in the individual cases that they got, you know, people's brothers, and one of the most famous cases that really did the rounds at that time was a teenage girl, maybe she might have been early 20s, not exactly sure of her age, who had died. And when she died, it was like her brother and her parents that were there, maybe other people as well, I can't quite remember, but her brother in particular, and her parents, their story and their description of how she died was like one of the at least as I remember it, one of the centerpieces of the kind of pro-assisted death argument. And I won't go into the details of what they said, but just think of the worst possible like death, and then just like it was worse than that. So that was one of the things. But the thing is, we've got this thing called palliative care. There isn't actually, I don't, I'm not a doctor, so I can't go into the medical side of it. But if someone is in that much pain and experiencing that type of a death, that's a failure of palliative care. That doesn't mean that we need to kill them. That's a failure of palliative care. And from the little I know of it, and absolutely from what they were describing, an absolutely abhorrent failure of palliative care. And if people have, and it's a completely genuine thing to be concerned about, of course, why would you not be concerned about that? We of course, we should be doing, whatever we can do reasonably to avoid those types of deaths. But the answer is not to empower doctors to just kill their patients. The answer is to find out what on earth is wrong in the palliative care system and fix it. That's the solution. So that whole argument that the pro-assisted dying sort of debate rested on it's just a fallacy. That is not the only alternative to assisted dying. Is a horrible death that you just have to endure. That's not the alternative. That's a false dichotomy that they're setting up. I have a thing about doctors and the medical profession generally. So, and I wrote a little thing about this. It wasn't very much, but I wrote something about it on Twitter just to see what people would say, and I got a little bit. But so I think that we've got a lot of problems in the medical profession, right? So we've got issues with vaccines. But wherever you sit in the vaccine debate, it should be abundantly clear to everyone that we do not have the information that we need. We don't have it. It's not being released. The proper data hasn't been collected. If you think that the people who are adamant that vaccines cause autism are conspiracy theorists or, parents of children who are just looking for something to blame, well, maybe there's an element of that. I don't know. I'm not an expert on it. I can't tell you. But I can tell you that we don't have the evidence that we need to actually know, right? The data we should have to know whether those vaccines are safe, we don't have it, right? That much is true. And that is actually the problem. In the absence of data, then people cannot actually make clear decisions. And that's a massive problem. But we have other problems in medicine as well. So the whole NHS is just a shit show, but the NHS has got such problems in maternity. And, they now pay out more in compensation payments to mothers whose babies have either died or been injured than the entire rest of the NHS maternity budget. So more than half of their budget is compensation payments. More than half. And every single maternity unit, just about, like, there is just scandal after scandal after scandal after cover up after scandal. It's an absolute disaster. And there's been other sort of various aspects of health and medicine that have just been so wrong. Another example is that England, the UK, are now looking to, and I think they're going to do it, I think the legislation has passed, the decision's been made, they're going to put folic acid in the flour. So folic acid is what pregnant women are advised to take to make sure that their babies will not have neural tube defects. I don't know how good the evidence is. I think the evidence is essentially sound that folic acid will prevent neural tube defects, or more accurately, a deficit in folate is a contributor to a neural tube defect in a baby. The data behind this decision, when they trialed, what happens when you give sort of this much folate, like the amount of folic acid they're going to put in flour. Like the thing with folic acid, it's not a case of the more the better. You don't just take as much, right? It's actually quite dangerous. You do not want to take too much folic acid as just a human, but especially as a pregnant woman. So if you're not deficient in it, you don't want to just take heaps and heaps and heaps, right? So, you know, the pregnancy multivitamins, they take they have a specific amount of recommended folic acid, which is why they tell you not to take more than one of them, and don't take too many, right? It's actually quite dangerous. You don't want to take too much. Well, they did the trial, a big chunk of the trial data, and I think it comes from Germany, might be where the data comes from, where they looked at the this sort of population-wide delivery of folate, and they discovered that yes, you know, there was like a reduction in the number of babies born with neural tube defects. However, for every baby that was not born with a neural tube defect because of the administration of this folic acid, I think there were 7 babies that died of other causes. So this folic acid is dangerous stuff, and they're putting it in the flour, and this is going to be another thalidomide. Like, this is what's going to happen, right? It's going to be a long-term scandal. It's going to cause problems that people will tell people are not happening, because it'll be, you know, very low. I mean, neural tube defects are very, very low frequency. Now, these, you know, supposedly negative side effects of having too much folate will be higher frequency than the neural tube defects were, but we're talking about such low numbers in absolute terms, right? So these are going to be ad hoc events. They're going to be very, very difficult to link to the folate. It's going to take a very long time for there to be a clear enough signal in the population data for anybody to actually say, yes, this is the folate. And that's going to be really hard because it's in the flour. So everyone's going to eat it. Like, what are you going to compare it to? What's the comparison going to be? There isn't going to be, you know, the people who are gluten intolerant, like the celiacs, like compared to them, maybe, I don't know, like anyway, it's going to be very, very difficult once this happens to actually identify any of the negative outcomes. And yet all of the information that is available to the government before they do this should tell them that there are going to be more ad hoc deaths, that you're not going to be able to link to the folate as a result of you doing this, than there are going to be children without neural tube defects who would otherwise have one. Like, and then there's a whole host of other people in the population as well. Like, again, I'm not a doctor, so I can't like rattle off the various conditions, but there are other people with particular conditions where having that amount of folate would also be quite dangerous. And again, it's going to be in the flour, it's going to be in everything. So it's going to do tremendous harm. And the reason why I started talking about that and telling you all of that is I have this idea about doctors that actually, I think that, you know, we've known this for thousands of years, since the sort of Hippocratic Oath was invented, that you actually need to work, the society needs to do some work against the innate tendency of doctors to harm their patients. So if we accept that humans are inherently competitive, right? Inherently competitive, and we are. Now, we managed to create these big, wonderful cooperative societies because we create rules, and we create rules about how people are allowed to behave and how people are not allowed to behave. But within that, you still get people who are trying to get an edge over other people. So imagine if you've got every human being, every decision maker in the chain, from the researchers to the doctors to the nurses to the people who teach in medical school, to the people at the drug administration agencies who decide whether the evidence of harm or help is good enough or strong enough, to the people in the hospitals, to the people making the decisions on the ground about the patients. Imagine every single one of those people has an implicit bias that they're not really aware of to take advantage of opportunities that present to harm other people in a plausibly deniable way. Just imagine that every agent acting in the system had this small implicit bias, nothing that they could do that would necessarily make them consciously aware they were doing it, because then their own conscious and their pro-social motives would get in the way. So we're talking just this slight implicit bias where, you know, you could just almost like a Freudian slip kind of thing, just make mistakes in a particular direction or make decisions with a particular level of bias or whatever, imagine what kind of a medical system you would have. You would have a medical system that would end up over-prescribing statins to everybody, even though they do tremendous harm. You would end up with a medical system that decides we should put folate in the flour. You would end up with a medical decision where a whole bunch of midwives in the NHS are just horrible, nasty bullies and do all sorts of horrible things to mothers in delivery rooms and to other midwives as well. And you end up with these terrible, terrible cultures within maternity units that end up bringing the whole maternity units down, because of course maternity units are the pointy end of human competition, right? That's what the competition is all about. So, you know, and I think that the reason why the Hippocratic Oath was kind of invented, the reasons is because people understood, like even, you know, way back in Greek and Roman times, people understood that you had to make sure that doctors understood and explicitly declared that they were not going to do any of these harms, that there was a natural tendency to harm that we had to actually work against and guard against. And so that's, you know, that's why we have the Hippocratic Oath. And I think that's why we have to be, you know, so careful. So if you know, you've got all of these, and again, the childhood vaccine schedule looked at from this perspective becomes incredibly scary, because we've got all of these people making decisions about adding vaccines to the kids' schedule without the requisite without the data that you would need to be sure that they were safe, under the supposed ethical guideline of, well, we cannot deny, you know, the current vaccine set to any child, so we can't actually do a null group for comparison, because we know that these vaccines help. So all we can do is compare the current vaccine schedule and then add one extra. And oh, look, you add one extra and you can't measure the harm. But every single doctor in that system, every single researcher, every single analyst should be absolutely well aware that it is actually really easy to accumulate harms from one step to another. And if you never compare the true null condition to many steps above, or you never actually compare the linear trend, if all you compare is 1 versus 2 and 2 versus 3 and 3 versus 4, every little bit of cumulative harm will not be large enough for you to be able to detect. And they should all know that. They should all be aware of the massive risk of the way that they are expanding the childhood vaccine schedule. They should be massively aware of that. They should also be hypersensitive, absolutely hypersensitive, given how many things they vaccinate against, that the odds of getting are so tiny. Now, part of the reason why the odds are tiny is because they vaccinate. I get that. But given that you are in a situation where the majority of kids are vaccinated and thus the diseases are incredibly rare, means that you are giving kids a heck of a lot of injections to protect them against diseases that in all likelihood they're not going to get. That means that from an ethical view, you have to be damn sure, absolutely damn sure that you're not doing any harm. Like, you've got to be absolutely certain that this is a dead set neutral intervention if they're not going to get the disease anyway. Otherwise, you can't justify doing it to one child, let alone population wide. Now, we are looking at parents who have been, you know, many parents who have been screaming for decades that this happened to my kid 2 days after he got vaccinated. This has happened to my kid, you know, within 24 hours of getting vaccinated. Now, what do the feminists do whenever any woman says anything about anything? Believe all women. What do they say when a mother says that my kid was perfectly normal before he got vaccinated and 2 days later this is what he's like? They say you're imagining it. They say, no, he always had autism. You just didn't want to believe it. And now he's got the vaccine and you've got something to blame it for. Don't blame the vaccine. It's not the vaccine's fault. It's not anyone's fault. It's just the way he was born. Some kids just develop with it. They don't want to listen. Why are pharmaceutical companies, doctors, in fact, you know, most part of civil society not jumping on every single one of these cases and going, right, let's have a look at what happened. Tell me what happened to your child. Let's do large scale studies. Let's examine individual case studies in detail. What happened? Let's find out. Something must have happened. And now we live in an age of video cameras and phones. Parents no longer have to convince doctors that their kids were normal before the injection. They've got the proof. They've got the footage. They've got the kid not having eye contact issues before the vaccines. Now, that doesn't mean that vaccines cause autism, right? I said before, I don't actually know. I don't think anyone knows because I don't think we've got the data. That's a massive problem that we haven't got the data. But the fact that we haven't got the data maintains plausible deniability. And the fact that we haven't got the data means that a lot of people find themselves in a situation where they, a very happy situation where they have the potential to promote something that could be harming children on a large scale. They don't know, but maybe it is. And they've got plausible deniability of cover. They've got moral righteousness to insist that, no, we need to get vaccines. Vaccines is for the good of everybody. We have to keep doing it. And so I think the resistance to wanting the data, it's not about necessarily that, we know this is harming them and so we don't want to get the data because it's going to prove it. It's more about it will remove our plausible deniability and we might not be able to do this anymore. That's what, not consciously, but that's what it's about. That's the actual motivation in there. It's not necessarily that they know. They don't know and they don't actually want to know. They actually are quite prone to a plausible deniability situation where they don't want to get the extra data because this is actually a great way to continue harming other people's offspring. And so we don't really want to stop doing it. Anyway, so I haven't been able to think this through clearly enough to be able to properly really articulate it, but I think that there is a social hostility, not just amongst doctors, amongst all people, right? All people have these tendencies, but doctors, nurses, midwives, health researchers, they're all in a unique position that provides them with opportunities that come with both huge social kudos, a desire to help, a desire to be seen to be helping, and great appreciation when they are seen to be helping, and plausible deniability when they're doing harm. And that is, I think, a very dangerous cocktail to give a human being when they have the care of another vulnerable human being in their care. And that is what we give to health workers. And I think that I think about this more, I might even change my own mind. Like, these are quite new thoughts for me. But my fear is that we've stopped working against that. We've stopped taking the Hippocratic oath seriously, and we've stopped guarding against the possibility that we have to guard against this. We've just in the same way as we slipped into that, or many people slipped into that just complete trust of the government and the health authorities and everything over COVID, and then got massively burnt. I think the same thing is happening with the rest of the health system, but just spread out over a much longer period of time. And so it's much harder to see it. It was very obvious with COVID, the trust and the burn. It's much less obvious with all these other examples, I think. Anyway, that is something I've been thinking about with the medical profession for a while. I've been thinking about it with abortion. I've been thinking about it with surrogacy, and I've been thinking about it with assisted dying and then the complete collapse of the NHS maternity system and the whole vaccine thing coming out. Like, I mean, that's clearly been spurred by how much people trusted the COVID vaccines and then how much damage they were shown to have done, right? That's given the whole, I don't want to say anti-vaxxer because that's sort of become a bit of an insult, but it's given the whole vaccine cautious movement a heck of a lot of steam that it didn't have before. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I actually think that's a good thing. I think that we should be doing everything humanly possible to make sure that vaccines are not harming kids. And one thing that is abundantly clear is that we're not. we're not doing everything humanly possible. We're not collecting the data. We're not making double, triple sure. We are not looking into every single instance of a parent claiming that this is a vaccine injury. We're just not doing any of that. We're ignoring all of it. We're pretending it just doesn't matter. We're pretending it's just not there.
And
And that is not.
if we keep going this pathway, where do you see yourself, or where not yourself, where do you see population as widespread as a whole in next 10 to 20 years?
I don't know about the next 10 to 20 years because I think the time frames are so hard to put on it. But I do think that it's coming to a crunch. It's like that little bit by little bit and then everything at once. And I don't know when the everything at once is going to hit, if you know what I mean. So I think we might. I mean, I think the UK is almost. I don't know. It's almost there now. Its economy is worse than Australia's, if you can believe that.
It's actually new fact for you. It's actually worse and poorer than any American state.
Wow. Well, there you go. I wonder where Australia would sit compared to American states. We'd be down near the bottom for sure. We're shit. Like, we are just in an absolute state at the moment. But you can see, looking at the UK, they are so much worse than us. I mean, we think that we've got it bad, but then you look over at the UK and you realise that actually we haven't hit rock bottom. Like, we have got further to fall, which is a bit scary. But so look, I think I suspect that it's just gonna continue along like it is. The things that have been happening will continue to happen. New laws will be introduced that, whether they're assisted dying laws or whether they're surveillance laws, or, that will continue to just tyrannize the population. We're going to continue to see the consequences of the porous borders and everything that goes along with that. That's just going to keep on happening. And so we're going to continue to see the anti-natal hostility and the demonization of masculinity and the demonization of motherhood. And it's just going to continue, I think, much as it is now. Something will probably happen, I think, a little bit like gender ideology. Like, I feel like it's kind of funny being in Australia, because we in Australia right now are kind of probably like the height of gender ideology. So for you guys in the US, it's kind of like the worst of it is kind of behind you. You've got the detransitioners coming out. There's going to be court cases. They're going to sue. And the similar thing is happening in the UK. The health secretary has finally admitted he was wrong when he said that women had penises. And they've got their own battles that they're fighting. It's not done and dusted by any means. But in Australia, we are still in the thick of it, because we are just behind. Like, we are just a decade behind the Northern Hemisphere and all of these sort of socio-political movements. And so it's kind of like being in two worlds at once. You've got like the other parts of the world where this is all like, it's safe to say that women don't have penises now. In Australia, it's still not safe to say that. So it's kind of,
it's not
like
safe.
Oh God, no. We are still in the part of the world where it's like transphobic to say that you don't think that like children should be given puberty blockers and be like castrated and have their 14, 15-year-old breasts chopped off. Like, that is still like, we're still in that, where that's that's not butchery, that's gender affirming care.
5 years behind. 5 years, it's 4 years behind. As in, I'm a decade in general, but 4 years as in the height of propaganda.
Yeah, that's right.
I think UK, in my opinion, again, it's opinion. Rather than focusing on the folic acid and all of that, like, which you made a really good point and made me think, sent me in a whole trance of thought. And then I came out on the other side of, again, accepting the whole libertarian view. You know how many birth defects are in the UK at the moment?
I know it's high.
It's high. And you know what racial or ethnic group of people are causing the most amount of birth defects?
Yeah, there's the cousin marriage.
Why is no one addressing that?
Because it's fine. Because it's not a problem to be solved. The NHS, did you not hear? It wasn't that long ago that the NHS, I don't know if it was a study or a white paper or something they released on the familial benefits of cousin marriage. You get,
what?
Yeah, cousin marriage is associated with like greater extended family support for the mother, and a whole bunch of other things that we should, so with that, it's not a, it's again, it's not a problem to be addressed because it's happening in the population that they are trying to welcome in, and they don't want to, they can't cause problems for that
For
population.
welcoming for what though? What is the contribution that you wouldn't find from other group of migrants or immigrants that you're so highly obsessed with them?
I don't know that it's necessarily them versus all other immigrants, but the whole point of the system, right? If your society is collapsing, right, and you're playing this game of musical chairs and you want to be amongst the lineages that are going to be there at the end so that you can be the founder population to mix with, when the barbarians come knocking at the door, it's got to be the barbarians that come knocking at the door. There is no point your civilization getting taken over by another civilization that is at roughly the same point of this cycle as you are, because it's also on the, it's no good if the other civilized civilizations come knocking at your door. They've got all the same problems you have. They're close to the end like you. You are looking for the people who are coming in who are still at this part of the phase, the spreading, the territorial, violent, lots of masculinity, lots of babies, that phase. That's who you're looking for. They are the people who carry the genes that have the potential to start the fresh population. It's no good. The ones like you are no good. The ones like you are doomed. The whole point of the system is to find the ones that are not like you and to welcome them in, not to find the ones that are like you. They're doomed. They're in the same basket you're in. They're in the same downward slide on the path to nowhere, not having babies, doing nothing that you're in. That they're finished. They're done for, like you're done for. You're looking for people who are at the beginning of that, right? So it's not necessarily any particular group, but it is going to be any group that shows those particular hallmarks. So it's going to be the groups that have the traditional old-fashioned sexist attitudes. It's going to be the groups that are having lots of babies. It's going to be the groups that are prone, where the men are prone to violence. It's going to be the groups that, are showing all of the civilizational signals of being in that part of the civilization where they've got all of that arc to go. So it's not necessarily that you predict them to favor this particular group of migrants over that particular group of migrants, but you would expect to see what we are seeing, which is a favoring in particular of groups of migrants from the East and the Third World over migrants from the First World, because the ones in the First World are all in our basket, and that's the fucked basket. That's the nearly finished basket. That's not the place where you invest your genes to be the start of the next generation. That's the dead end basket, right? That's our basket.
Chaos. Even J.D. Vance, the vice president of the U.S., was like, well, we don't want Iran to be superpower, as in, nuclear power. And now they're worried about, the Pakistan's kind of the nuclear power, but now they're really worried if the UK is going to be the new Islamic regime of the nuclear power, which is a bigger threat to the whole world as an entire, because it's not that it's just the Islamic as in the religion that's been pushed. It's a political ideology.
Yes, that's right. It's political Islam. Islamism, some people call it, but yeah, I know what you mean. It's not the I mean, it's hard to untangle the religious aspect from the political aspect, but it is the political system that we're talking about, right? That's the issue.
And I've witnessed, I've talked to people, and there's no hesitation of, like, it's like a migrant. I can speak for my country, let's just say. A migrant from India coming out and preaching out how he's so nationally patriotic towards the Indian system. Okay, then fuck off there. Like, what the fuck are you doing and preaching it outside to these nations who you're coming to, using their system to feed your pockets and help your family out, and yet being patriotic towards the country that you just left behind? Make it make sense, please. It's we can keep going all day long, but at the end of the day, we don't control the power, what's happening up in the UK. So all we can do is fingers crossed, well, it's a ride they've chosen to for high tolerance, in my opinion, and I guess it's just to wait and see the drama where it leads to. I believe in New Zealand there was a protest of send the other religious group. I don't know which one. But they're like, we don't want that wickedry over in our country. And New Zealandese are very patriotic in that sense of protecting their land, and I think they were rebelling against that, which is good because these third worlders are coming out pushing their political ideologies on these countries, which isn't healthy because you don't want it to be new third world. You left the country for a reason.
Definitely no, definitely not. And I think I do think that there is naivety is not quite the right word. There's a better word for it, but there is this lack of appreciation of what life is actually like in parts of Africa and the Middle East. Like I genuinely think that even though I've spent almost all of this conversation and much of the last year and a half sort of arguing for people behaving in certain ways, because those behaviors have been selected for because of the genetic outcomes they will ultimately end up producing, and so it doesn't require people to have any conscious understanding of what they're doing, and that's certainly true. But we do have many examples in psychology where people's conscious understanding of stuff can get in the way of those types of behaviors because we are complex creatures, and yes, we might have a whole bunch of these motives, but part of that is our pro-social motives and various other motives that we have that can get in the way of behaving in these quite it's quite sort of malevolent ways if we can be made to see that they actually are malevolent, where frequently people don't. But people just, I think, just they don't have any appreciation of what counts as normal there. And every now and again you get a glimpse of it, right? So Northern Ireland got a glimpse of what happens when that man attempted to cut off that other man's head in the street. Like occasionally there's a glimpse of what happens, but there is so little appreciation for how different people are and how differently people behave. Like, I mean, even the complete lack of coverage of what's happening in Sudan. That's there's nothing. They're just not telling us anything. That it's not being shown on. And I think part of it is because it doesn't suit the various interests and narratives to tell those stories. But I also do think that another part of it is I'm not sure that they actually can tell those stories. I think that I'm not sure they have the stomach for it. Like it's horrendous, and I'm not quite sure that they could put it on the 6 o'clock news and get away with it. So I there is just this huge lack of appreciation of how much the rest of the world is not like us. And the whole rest of the world that's not like us are not all the same as each other. Like, there's plenty of variation out there, but I don't think people, and I guess probably the most ridiculous demonstration of it is like the idiots out marching like queers for Gaza and stuff like that. It's just it's so insane. Like you have, and even the women that march along with them, and it's like, you've honestly got no idea what would happen to you if you went to Gaza and tried to do, like, you've just got, like, it's the stupidest irony in the world that the only reason that they can dress like that and adorn themselves like that and then walk down the street and chant like that is because they're not in Gaza, right? Like, it's just so mental. It is so mental. And they had every opportunity to understand, October the 7th gave them every opportunity to actually see, and my God, the demonstration of willful blindness, like, honest to God, the demonstration of willful blindness. I don't know how you can be paying attention on, like, it was October the 7th, but in Australia, because we're ahead, it was already October the 8th, right? So it was October the 8th when we were finding out. I don't know how you can be sitting in Australia and watching all of that play out, or effectively live in front of you on October the 8th, and by like just 48 hours later, you're at the Opera House joining in some, celebration, and then standing up, in front of various microphones in the weeks and months and years afterwards, and declaring that, oh no, there were no Israeli women raped on October the 7th. That's all been debunked. Like, it's just, how do these people's brains work? I don't understand. Like, I know we all engage in a level of self-deception, and I'm sure I do it, but that is just next level. How do you have any engagement with a cause at all and be that willfully ignorant? How does your own brain let you do that? That's mad to me. I can't. I cannot with those people.
How about we relax a little bit with a quick rapid fire round? How does that sound?
Okay, all right, let's go.
It's like I'm the same way, who gets carried away and feels deeply for the world, but I think it's time we relax a little bit, me and you both.
Okay. All
right. I'm going to make it easier for both of us. I need you to describe in one word.
Oh, Jesus.
And I'll just name a few things.
Not my strength.
Female intrasexual competition.
Savage.
Makeup.
Ridiculous.
Instagram.
No, that's the one I should have said ridiculous for.
Need to think of synonymous. And let's go for the dating advice industry.
Oh, just a bit sad, I think. I think sad. There's a lot of well-meaning people, I think, who are trying really hard, and that's a bit sad because they're getting it very wrong. And there's just a lot of awful people, and that's sad as well because that's causing drama. And there's probably good people there too, but then on balance, you would have to say that if they're effectively failing, aren't they? Because it's not working, and so that's also sad. That's also sad. That's just sad all round.
Empowerment.
Oh, empowerment. That's very hard. Empowerment. Focus.
Testosterone.
What was that?
Testosterone.
Oh, testosterone. Man.
Evolutionary psychology.
A mixed bag. A mixed bag that's not one word, but a mixed bag that tries very hard and does well some of the time.
Gossip.
There should be one word for that.
One word, yeah.
Gossip. Tempting. It's too tempting.
Charles Darwin.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yourself. You should have used interesting right now, but you already used that.
It's interesting. I got to think of another one now. Okay, me. Probably. There was a time when I think I would have said, like, industrious, like just hardworking. I think I would have said that that's probably the most me thing that there is. But I don't think that's quite true anymore. I think now there's something a bit better than that. I'm still very hardworking. That's still close. But something a little bit more focused. A little bit more focused.
Donald J. Trump.
Oh, competent. I think he's one of the most competent people on the planet.
Sex.
Essential.
culture versus evolution?
Incorrect. They're never versus each other.
You're a woman publishing findings that are pretty flattering or unflattering for some people
Yes.
about how women behave.
Mm-hmm.
What has that actually cost you so far?
So far, I'm pleased to say, not very much. Well, okay, hang on. As far as I know, not very much. Every now and again, I get little inklings or rumblings on the grapevine that somebody somewhere might not be happy. But as far as that affecting me, so far, not at all. And I would actually probably credit my institution actually with that, credit where I work with that, because I think that, I'm perfectly happy to criticize where I work. I'm a loyal employee, and that means, telling the truth. And so, on a different day, I will spend all day criticizing where I work, as every academic is happy to do. But on that particular point, I will actually say that they have been a standout. On that particular point, an absolute standout.
What's a powerful story that you've heard that always stuck with you?
Oh, that's a good one. Powerful story I've heard that always stuck with me. So the only one that, this is probably not, I don't know if this is even a good one, but, and it's not even really a story because he didn't even really get a chance to tell it. But my grandfather was Romanian, and he escaped fighting for the resistance against the Soviets in Romania.
Mm-hmm.
He escaped, and he met my grandmother, who was Austrian. No, I've already got it wrong. I've already got it wrong. Him and his platoon, that's probably not what they were called, but anyway, him and his platoon were on holidays. That's right. They got a break from the front line. And I don't know how exactly he met my grandmother, but he did. And as a result, he absconded. So the rest of his platoon went back, and he didn't go back. So then, of course, he had to flee, because if they'd found him, he would have been executed. So he then had to flee, and he one of a way that people used to flee is they used to swim across this particular point of the Danube, and the guards at that station would be forced to fire on them because they'd see someone swimming across the Danube, but they used to deliberately miss. And so he was swimming across the Danube, and they fired on him, and they missed. And that's how he escaped. And it's only because he met my grandmother that he didn't go back and fight, and probably would have been killed. But then they stayed together forever and had, 5 children and umpteen million grandchildren. And I think, well, we may have, things like this in our future, but I think people of my generation, I don't think understand what that's like. Like, I don't think they understand what their own grandparents, whether they were in a war, whether they were in something else or whatever. But I don't, I'm not quite sure I could imagine the constitution that it would take to swim out across the Danube, know that the guard is going to be forced to shoot, and hope that it's one of your mates on duty so that he will miss. I mean, that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary. Yeah.
What's the most powerful piece of advice you've ever received as a woman?
Oh. Who has given me good advice? I've received a lot of terrible advice. I've received a lot of terrible advice from a lot of people. Who has given me excellent advice? Oh, in fairness, actually, I think my dad's given some pretty good stuff, actually. I think in his,
No
especially
wonder.
in his, yeah, especially in his younger days. So I remember, so I remember him taking the effort, um, once to sit me and my, I've got two older sisters, but me and my middle sister. So just the two of us, not sure why the older one wasn't there. But to sit me and my sister down one day and to basically say that like just no excuses. Like no excuses. Like, you make your decisions, you own the consequences of those decisions, and if things go well, that's because you earned it, and if they didn't go well, that's on you as well, and you have to work out how to fix it. Like, like he said, you can make up all the excuses in the world for why things don't work out, but if you do that, you're just giving yourself reasons not to solve the problem. And I remember that. And actually, there's another bit of excellent advice as well, because I got that same message in a very different context from a guy that I used to work for. Back when I was doing my PhD, I worked just in like a little owner operator shop, right? I worked for him for a couple of years. He was a great guy. He owned the shop. He was retired, and he used to work in, says, some big executive in retail before he retired. And his retirement hobby was that he just like ran this shop. So he didn't really care whether he made a profit, like he just ran this shop, and he just hired people, and he just really liked teaching people about retail. And he said that same message. He explained that when someone comes into your shop and steals from you, it's not their fault, it's your fault. And that doesn't in any way excuse shoplifting. I'm not kind of like, it's not on that side of the fence, but he was just and he also used to, like, you couldn't do it these days, but he also used to like just wrestle shoplifters and call the police. So he wasn't talking about it's not their fault as in let them off, but he was basically saying, look, if they steal from you, that's because number one, you haven't got good enough security, and number two, you haven't been able to deter them, kind of thing. So if they steal from you, yeah, you can get angry at them, but it's your job to make yourself the kind of shop that people don't steal from and can't steal from. And part of him doing that was like wrangling actual thieves and physically stopping them from leaving while he called the police. He was tops. He was a great guy. Anyway, but yeah, and so that was kind of like that was a similar kind of advice in a very different situation. Like, even when someone is committing a crime that they are obviously responsible for, and you have every intention of making sure they get punished, you still, as the victim, recognize that you have to do everything in your power to make sure you're not that victim again. So that was similar type of advice, I guess. And I think that is very good advice. Whatever happens to you, you still, you can't worry about what people do. You can't worry about things that you don't control. All you can worry about is things that you do control, and you control those as best as you can.
Great advice, actually. I'd say it's a very, very resonating. If every woman listening understood one thing about how they compete, one thing that would set them free rather than trap them, what it would be?
I would say that so much of it is a mirage. That's the one thing that, so women are incredibly like bound by this social pressure to do this and to do that and to do that, and the fear of the consequences. And look, in some senses, those consequences can be terrible. Like in high school, obviously, is like one scenario we can think of where like girls can just make life absolutely hell for other girls, and that can happen in workplaces too. But actually, for the most part, that hold that other women have of you that make you feel compelled to do this and compelled to that, it's actually mostly a mirage. For the, in 99% of times, you can actually just ignore it and just not do it and just do whatever you want to do, and there's actually not going to be any consequences. That you actually are giving, they're only taking 1% of the control that they have over you. You're actually handing over the other 99%. You can, in fact, just disengage from the whole stupid game, and for the most part, nothing bad will happen. It's actually almost entirely like fictitious. It has such a hold on people, and everybody does it, and so it works. But you can just not do it. You can just not do it.
Well, Danny, been 3 hours. Just looked at the time. Wow, it just felt like 10 minutes for me. But it's been great having you. What do you think of the podcast so far? How do you feel right now, right after the whole spiel?
I think it's been fantastic. It's great. I've talked about a bunch of things I've not talked about before, which I always like doing. It helps me think things through. I hope it's okay for people listening, because I'm pretty sure there's a difference when I'm speaking about something that I've really thought through and I'm really sure of. And then when I'm kind of thinking and speaking at the same time, it's probably a bit less clear and a bit rambling. I don't know, but
that's more of the authentic version, I'd say.
I like the chance to do that, though. I like the chance to think out loud and to actually try ideas and see what they sound like out loud when I've only had them in my head before. I like doing that.
A good thing. I think you needed an outlet, and thank you for allowing us to be that outlet for you.
You're very welcome.
And just tell people, whoever's listening, where can they find you? What's new for you? What's next for Dr. Danny?
So find me on X at Dr. Danny S. I also have a podcast that I am trying very hard to write more on, because at the moment it's a little bit sad. There's not a lot on there, but it's there. Sorry, not a podcast, a Substack. But there's a little thing, there's a few things there, and it's called And All Things Nice. But if you just follow me on X, anything that goes on the Substack goes on X anyway. So, and in fact, everything I do goes on X, and so you won't miss anything if you just follow me there. I've got a bunch of papers that I'm currently writing up, some under review already. So once that research is out, I'll be able to start talking about that a little bit more. And yeah, I'm just going to keep trying to do podcasts and keep trying to talk about this stuff. And so hopefully you'll see a bit more of me around the traps, but we'll see how that goes.
Well, we'd love to have you for part 2 if there is one. And
yeah, I'm keen. I'm keen for a part 2.
We'll be in on it, and we can dive deeper into the things, like as if you would have thought more things at that time or whenever that happened in the future. But until then, guys, if you're listening to this, please go down in the link. Please go down in the description. Fuck, I'm fucking it over. I have to cut this one out. Please go down in the description. Like, comment, share. I just slept for like 2 hours, is what I know, but we're here. Comment, share, subscribe, and I'll put Danny's socials down below. So make sure you drop a follow and support the channel. And until then, I'll see you the next time.